And you're good to go, Mark.
Okay, welcome everyone. Sorry, we're getting getting going just a couple of minutes later, but my name is Mark Kiefer. I'm the chairman of the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission. I'm calling to order the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission public hearing at 5:03 p.m. on Thursday, March 20th, 2025. So this is the March 2025 hearing of the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission, and we're joined today by Commission Vice Chair Arian Allen, as well as Commissioners Feingold, Fleck, and Jackson. Today, the Commission will be holding a public hearing to review applications in accordance with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, including the most recent March 20th, 2025 amendment, which is today, extending the suspension of these provisions until June 30th, 2027. We're conducting this meeting online, which is to say over Zoom. To ensure public access to deliberations of the Architectural Commission, the public may access this call through telephone and video conferencing, again, aka Zoom. The hearing, if you are just joining us, is being recorded, so all further conversations between commissioners should be audible to the public in attendance until the meeting has adjourned. And at this point, we'd like to acknowledge any members of the media or elected officials who are present. Let's see, I see Dan Murphy from the Beacon Hill Times. Welcome, Dan. Thanks for joining us. Any other members of the media or elected officials, including folks from the offices of our elected officials who sometimes join? Okay, I'm not seeing any, but we'll certainly acknowledge you if we find you.
Looks like Samantha's here from Councilor Durkin's office.
Oh, hi, Samantha. Sorry, didn't mean to ignore you there. Thanks very much for joining. Anyone else?
I think that's it.
Media or elected officials? Okay, I think that's it. Let's see. Members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions and provide public comment on applications and discussions. We will indicate during the course of the adjudication of each application when we're going to have a public comment period. So there's one for each application. We'll give you a heads up when that public comment period is reached. And if you want to be heard on the record, you will need to, you don't have to turn your camera on, but you will need to make your comments audible. And to do that, just raise your hand, not just like this, but using the button probably at the bottom of your Zoom panel that says raise your hand. There's some handy instructions on the screen as to how to do that right now. So again, we'll give you the heads up when it's time to take public comment on each application. If you want to be heard, raise your hand in the Zoom, and then Nick will call on you in turn, and you can be heard. Okay, let's see. I think that is it. So we are ready to begin the hearing. And first up on the agenda, no violations this month, so we'll go right to design review. First item is 101 Chestnut Street. Is there a representative from 101 Chestnut Street, who I believe is Linda Kane? Did I see Linda? I thought I saw Linda.
No, Linda's dialing in today. I'm just going to see if I can find a phone number. I think this might be her. Linda, if you can hear us, you can dial, press *9 on your phone to raise your hand, and I'm going to try to unmute you. Oh, there we go. There she is. Okay.
Very good. Welcome, Linda. You want to give us just a brief summary of what you are proposing? Oh, I think she's still muted.
Yeah. See if I can figure this out. Unmute yourself, press *6, Linda. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Good. We would like to paint all the windows that are right now Benjamin Moore Essex Green. We would just like to paint them, all the windows from that first floor up, Benjamin Moore Historic Black.
Okay, so
Hello?
yes, yeah. So the same color for all the windows. Now, just to refresh our recollection, you had previously, there it is right there on the screen. You had previously applied and been approved to paint them the Benjamin Moore Annapolis Gray, which is what we see on the screen. Hopefully our fellow can see that. And you've changed your mind, is what you're saying, yeah.
Yes, we think that we did the grates at the very bottom of the building, the Benjamin Moore, Annapolis Gray, which were perfect because they blended in with the stone at the bottom of the building. But in looking at that, we all agreed that I just looked at my neighbors that had the black window trim for around those upper windows, and we think that it will just be much more handsome and more of a statement to paint them in that historic black. We think the white will look dated and it's still going to look too choppy.
Okay, now, just as a general rule, and I know you probably recall this as a part of the discussion last time, I think, we have guidelines about paint colors, and you know, we do have some degree of flexibility. What we're not trying to require is, you know, that the building be returned to the color it was painted originally when it was built. That's often difficult, if not impossible, or at least very expensive to determine and so forth. But what we do try to do, and what we do require, is that the color has some relationship at least to historical appropriateness for the building, understanding when the building was built, the style in which it was built, and of course, you know, later modifications and so forth. And so let me ask it as a question. Is there a sort of it sounds like the basis of your change of heart here on the color was more aesthetic rather than historic, but is there a sort of a historic basis from which your
well, yes, as I look around at all my well, not right across the street at 128 or the school, but as I go down Chestnut Street, many of those residents are painted in that Benjamin Moore historic black, because I've spoken to them to make sure that, you know, I'm getting the historic color. And I think that it is, in fact, more keeping historically with the feel of what is promoted on Beacon Hill.
Right. Okay. So for sure, there are plenty of buildings. It's not hard to find them, whether nearby, even next door, or elsewhere, that have a black trim or black doors and things like that. You know, so certainly that's it's not to say that there aren't such buildings on Beacon Hill. I think the question that that we are dealing with, though, is what is most appropriate for this specific building. There are, as you would appreciate, even in that stretch of Chestnut Street, or the portion of Chestnut Street on the flat of the hill, a variety of styles of buildings that were built, although relatively more recently than some of the oldest vintages on the hill, over some period of time, such that some are actually much older than others. So it's instructive or helpful, I think, to find, do you find this color elsewhere in nature, as it were, elsewhere in the neighborhood, but not necessarily determinative. And I think just looking at this building, I think I'm more inclined to think about other buildings that are in this particular style, or you know, of a similar vein. What I see when I look at other buildings, even by this same architect, the Lincolnshire building, for example, which, unlike most of your other Chestnut Street neighbors, which are, you know, beautiful townhouses but much smaller in scale, the Lincolnshire building that goes between River and Charles Street is like your building, a grand, quite lovely, very large apartment building. And what you see, I don't know if Nick can bring that up for us. There it is. What you see in general is that in this building, and even the building next to it, is what appears to be, at least, I'm not asserting this is original, but it's been like this for a long time, both buildings. What you see, that the general treatment of the paint colors is to contrast them with the masonry. So in the Lincolnshire on the right, it's red brick contrasted with this sort of cream colored, a light color. The building on the left, a light masonry contrasted with the dark window trim and so forth. And so it seems to me these buildings, which are of a similar period, as it turns out, the Lincolnshire by the very same architect, right, Nick? I'm right about that?
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
You know, are, I think, maybe better examples than, let's say, a townhouse that might be of a different style and even maybe
Yeah.
different vintage. But
Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize the time here. I want to hear what my colleagues have to
Well,
think about this.
I kind of want to go back to your question. I understand that your answer was that you looked at your neighbors, but I think his question was asking historically for the building, what
Yeah.
colors, like, do you see, like, looking in the history of the building, what was the original color? Did you ever see black listed as the original color?
I did not. I believe that Essex green has
Okay.
been, I think the Essex green, which is there presently, has been there probably since, well, as far as I can recollect, going back that I am familiar with, to about 1970. So I don't know. The building was completed in 1920. So figure 1920, 25. I do not know what that original paint was, but I think I'm thinking the Essex green right now is about 50 years old.
Okay, so Nick, by chance, do you see anything, or have you seen anything for like what the color was historically for that building? Because that would make the most sense. I mean, if you're going to change the color, might as well make it as close as you can to what was originally there.
Yeah. The only thing that I can find about the color palette of a building in this vintage and style would be that it would be a darker color. Traditionally, sometime with like the Italian revival, so it could have been something like an Essex green or a black, but there's really no information about the original color that I could find, and I've kind of searched everywhere.
Yeah, the green definitely
And-
makes it more unique, but yes, I don't know how the other commissioners.
So may I just interject one thought or just make a statement? When we first petitioned to have the trim painted light, there was one gentleman in the meeting, and I don't recall who it was, who said, you know, I don't think the light is appropriate. He said, I think, and someone had said it would look a little choppy or whatever, but it wasn't appropriate. Going to the darker would be more appropriate for the style, the historic aspect of the building. So we're just hopeful that you can honor our request here.
Okay, let's see. I want to take public comment on this because I think the Civic Association's got a view on this. But also, so we'll come back to the commissioners unless there's any, I mean, it's pretty straightforward what they're doing, but unless there's any clarifying questions, just making sure we understand what's proposed. They're talking about painting everything. Okay, why don't we go ahead and take public comment and then we'll come back to discussion.
Okay.
If you want to be heard on the record, please raise your hand in the Zoom using the button probably at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and Nick will acknowledge you and unmute you.
Okay. First up we have is Holland with the Civic Association. Holland, go ahead.
Thank you. We do not oppose this application as submitted, although we note a 1919 neo-federal building would more typically have had light sashes on light trim. Thank you.
Holland, since you mentioned it, can you tell, is there, not to put you on the spot, but since you kind of are on the spot already, and you have the floor, when you say a 1919 neo-federal building would more typically have light sashes on light trim, can you tell us a little bit more about, do you have any other further information on the basis of that? I'm not challenging that statement. It sounds very consistent with what I would have thought, again, given the other extant examples around the neighborhood, but is there any resource that you found that would shed some further light on this?
I don't personally have a resource to point you to, Mark. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I figured I would ask. Thank you. Anyone else? I see Rochelle.
Okay, Rochelle, go ahead.
Yeah, the resource is the historic New England color chart. that calls out what colors are specific for windows for which time period. Like on light on federal. Dark on light trim for dark sashes like for revival.
That's the historic New England one, Rochelle.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And that's a resource. It's, again, it's not a rule or anything, but it's a common resource that we refer to because it does reflect, it's not exhaustive, but it does reflect a lot of experience and research on colors that at least were known to be used. Again, not the exclusive list of colors, but colors that were known to be used. And Rochelle is pointing out that it references buildings of this period having lighter sashes and so forth. Can you, I have that, Rochelle. Can you just point us specifically to where you found that on the chart?
That would be if you have the physical copy. It comes with a bunch of 8.5, 11 times 0 pieces of paper. They write it all out. And there's also a variant version that is not the same using their website link.
Okay, yeah, I've got a PDF here. Okay, well, I won't belabor it. But thank you for that reference. Any other public, anyone else want to weigh in from the public?
Not seeing any other hands, Mark.
Okay, let's turn it back to the commission then. Commissioners, any other views? Mo, Ralph, or Ed
Yes.
want to weigh in on this?
Yes, since it's Mo.
Yes, Commissioner Feingold, please go ahead.
I usually don't weigh in very much on the color of windows because you've waxed very eloquently about them over the years and wanting the variety of colors rather than one color to dominate. But in this particular instance, I feel that painting all those in the way this image shows right now, painting all those windows black would be really heavy contrast and would diminish the overall lightness that we see in the building. And there are plenty of examples around, but I just well, that's only my only comment. I just think it would look very heavy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, Linda, for what it's worth, I think you know, we've mentioned a couple of resources that talked about in general having lighter sash for buildings of this period. We looked at the example of Lincolnshire. What you've got now is a sort of an interesting in between, but it's still, there's, I think, a pretty clear intention architecturally, which is that, you know, green is the complementary contrasting color. It's opposite on the color wheel from red. And so it seems the intention here was to complement, but at the same time contrast with the red brick. So that is doing, in effect, with color, what I was illustrating with the Lincolnshire building is doing in light and dark. In other words, the Lincolnshire illustrates how they would use a light color to contrast a dark color. This is a green to contrast a red. So what Commissioner Feingold, I think, is concerned about is that you're kind of losing both of those things if you go to black. I'm not to put words in his mouth, but
yes.
It's you know, it's too heavy relative to the dark brick, and it's not a subtle enough you know, complement to the colors.
I understand.
I definitely agree with that. I think that if you painted them all black, not only would it be heavy, it would make it look more modern, which is, you know, this is not a modern neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, again, not to belabor this, but Linda, one of the reasons you see a lot of sort of cream and black in the neighborhood is ironically around this time and the colonial revival period, you had on the one hand a sort of renaissance of classical interest in classical design and particularly of the colonial period, but also a pretty distinct color palette, which included a lot of those creams and blacks and so forth, on other houses, not necessarily buildings like this. And that, I think people happen to like that, has been copied quite a bit since then, even applied to earlier buildings. And so the prevalence of black paint in Beacon Hill is out of proportion. I think I will assert, I can't prove it, but sitting right here, but I think is out of proportion to the actual historicity of the how common that color was over
Yes,
the long
I
history of Beacon
understand.
Hill.
Okay,
So
yeah.
now a couple of, well, but I want to make sure if Commissioner Jackson or Fleck have a view, we hear them. Not that you have to, but
Go ahead, Ralph.
I think you're muted, Ralph.
Sorry. I'm sorry, I was muted. What if you went to a darker shade of the current color?
Well, my suggestion was, in listening to what what we're tending toward here, that we just maintain the Essex green or the historic, darkest Benjamin Moore historic green. I think it's basically maintaining the same color. We're just going to be the windows need to be painted, new storms need to be put on, painted obviously with it. So if we just, I guess it looks like the option, the better option would be to keep it in that dark green.
That would be lovely.
I mean, I understand. I do.
My comment was,
sorry.
My
Yes.
comment was more about your right to refresh your building. And if there's an argument about color and you're not using a black option, but if you are happy with the color that you have and simply refresh it, yes.
Yeah, I think certainly
Okay.
that's an option. That it's, again, it's been there for 50 years. I'd suspect, Ralph, if you just reapplied that same color, it would be darker than what we're looking at now, just by virtue of its
Yes.
age, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's
Yeah.
what you're getting at. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And that's fine. If that's what the Historic Commission feels is going to be appropriate, then we will obviously work in concert with you people, definitely. Okay, yes, continue.
Okay, so what we could do, unless Ed, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I was just gonna, do a simple force rank. My preference would be the green, the beige that was previously approved, and the third and the, in last place would be the black. So, I think the applicant is shown a willingness to take the input, and
Okay.
that's where we're heading.
So it
seems.
sounds
So
like
that's good.
we've got a consensus. So maybe what I'd like to do is, since if Linda, you're comfortable, you got an approval already for the beige color. By rights, I think you can certainly redo it, what you've got there. So I think.
Yes.
So I think what we could do is just give you an approval today to basically amend the prior approval to include the repainting in kind of the existing color, and then we would just require you to submit a paint chip of that to confirm exactly what the color is that you're going to use to redo the green.
Okay, so
Yeah.
will that require another
No,
meeting?
No,
or
that's
can
what I'm
I
trying
just submit that and I'll do that? I'll send that to Nick.
Yes.
And could Nick weigh in on this, Nick? Because I know you're so informed with all this, Nick. How do you feel about what your colleagues have said about the heaviness of the black? Are you in concert with that?
I am, yeah. I think the
Okay.
decision that the commission is headed towards is probably the best one, in my opinion.
Okay, to keep it with the present color, and then we can just put in that fresh coat of paint,
Yes.
and I will send you the appropriate chip. It will just be the Benjamin Moore. It will be historic of that. You know, I think it's called black. It's actually called not Essex green, but I'm remembering this, black forest green. So it's the green, but it's dark like the Essex green. So I can just submit that chip.
Yes. So you will need another meeting. And again, if you have the prior approval for the, what was the color called again? Forgive me. The beige color?
I'm
Annapolis gray.
Annapolis gray. So you have the prior approval for the Annapolis gray. So if you take this back to your neighbors and they say, well, between the gray and the green, we'd rather have the gray, you can do it the gray as well. And again, you wouldn't have to come back, if that makes sense.
Okay. And if we just replace it and I just send you the green chip, I don't need to have another meeting.
Correct.
That's approved as well.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
So I shall do that then, and we're going to go with that. The Benjamin Moore, that historic green. I will send Nick a chip within the next couple of days, and I'll know that that's been appropriately sanctioned by the commission.
Yep.
So I'm not going to get in trouble.
Yeah. We'll unless there's further discussion, we'll take a vote now to formalize that. You'll get a letter from
Okay.
Nick and so forth. So
Okay.
with that, I will move that the app. Oops, sorry, Nick. Sorry.
No, sorry, Mark. Ed Fleck.
Oh, Ed, yeah.
One follow-up question for Linda. You mentioned something about new storm windows. Were you intending to put additional or new storm windows on, or just repair existing ones?
Just repairing. We're repairing the windows. We've got some broken storms. They're all going to be repaired. And so obviously in the repair job, we're going to obviously have to have them painted, the trims painted, the ones that need to be repaired. Other than that, that's all we're doing.
But windows that don't have storms today would not have storms in the future.
Oh, exactly.
Good.
Exactly.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that clarification.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Thank you, Linda. Okay, I'll move that the application be approved with the proviso that the color be either the previously approved Annapolis gray or a repainting in kind of the existing color green with, in either case, a paint chip of the final color provided to staff for his approval prior to the commencement of any work.
I second that.
Okay, and we will vote. Commissioner Allen,
Aye.
Commissioner Feingold,
Aye.
Commissioner Fleck,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
and Commissioner Kiefer votes aye. Thank you very much, Linda. You'll get a letter from Nick just formalizing that determination. If you have any questions, just follow up with him directly. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. May I hang up now?
You may.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your time. And Nick, I'll send you that correspondence. I'll get that over to you tomorrow.
I'll look forward to it, Linda. Thank you so much for your help.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks.
Take care now.
Okay, next is 35 Beacon, which I believe is Mike Fay, representative from 35 Beacon. If you were here, there's Mike, I think, Street and Company. Hi, Mike.
Hello, good evening, everyone.
Thanks for coming in or coming on. Do you want to just give us a quick summary of what you are proposing?
Sure. So I was on hearing a few months ago presenting a very similar application for 65 Anderson, if you remember that. So I've kind of modeled this presentation around that same intercom installation. So this is the view of the main entrance of 35 Beacon Street from the sidewalk. You can just barely see the right side, or on the right side, their existing intercom. We'll take a look at that in a moment. So this is also a view from the sidewalk where I just, in some blue painter's tape, basically outlined the area of the proposed new butterfly intercom. And we go to a couple more slides. So there it is. We want to have it on the opposite side of the current intercom, which just makes sense based on the way the door opens. And so the next slide should be the details on the butterfly model. It's their recessed model. So this is going to be sort of built right into the wall, just to keep it from the standard model usually sticks out at least 2 inches. So this one's going to be built right into the wall. It'll have the stainless steel mounting plate. That's this, 10 by 16.5 area. Of course, this is going to come with the brass cover box that we should see on the next slide, right? So this is a size built. It's slightly larger than the one that would accompany their standard model. Since this is the recessed model, the mounting plate's slightly larger. So so it's going to be 12 inches by 18 inches. So ever so slightly larger than the mounting plate that we saw on the previous slide, and it's going to be it has to stick out a minimum of 2 inches. This is the same installer, same company that did the previous job at 65 Anderson, which was just a different shape intercom and box. And this is the other side of the front entrance where we can see the current intercom that's non-functional, and if everything is approved, we'll have everything taken down and cleaned up as best as possible.
Okay, I've got a question.
Hey, Arian, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just realized, I forgive me for not mentioning this sooner. I'm an abutter to an abutter of this, and under our abundance of caution rule, I think I need to recuse myself of this for this one. So could you please take over the moderating of this discussion? So your timing is perfect.
Okay. All right. Well, why would you go and make another opening when you can take what's already there, replace that, and not add, more destruction to something that's already rather old? This is more hidden. So according to what you were showing, pulled out, that's like if I was passing those stairs, I would never see that intercom. So wouldn't it make more sense to replace what's there? And that way it's really out of the sight of the public.
Right. So this design has gone through a few iterations, and originally we did basically want to take out the existing one and put a new butterfly sort of in that same 45-degree angle position right there. But it really wasn't going to work.
Why wouldn't it work?
Well, the intercom mounting plate for the butterfly model is slightly wider, so we thought about taking off that 45-degree mounting plate, putting it just on the brownstone, facing completely away from the sidewalk. There wasn't enough space in that little section of the brownstone. The intercom would, it was too wide for that. And they thought, well, what if we made a new triangular mounting plate, basically just to recreate this exact same design, and it wouldn't be the recessed model, so it would stick out a little bit further than the current intercom.
Yep.
And it was decently visible from the sidewalk. I sort of mocked that up and sent Nick some photos.
Hey, Mike, I can help you out here a little bit. Arian, to answer your question here, so Mike had originally proposed what you're recommending. However, with the butterfly unit, which we typically don't allow in the neighborhood because of the LED screen, with that unit positioned on that existing location, you would be able to see the illumination and the LED screen. So when we kind of take our rule of thumb in terms of when we approve or when it's appropriate to approve one of these butterfly boxes, meaning it's on a facade that's not facing the street. It is kind of in a door vestibule. There's no major renovations on the interior of the building, and you can center these where it's not obscuring any of the architectural details, which in this circumstance, all of those conditions are met. Additionally, this property originally likely, from what I can understand, looking at the architecture of the building, probably had a stoop that led up to the second floor that has since been modified. So this is not an original condition. So it seems as though this may have been the most appropriate option for this particular location, considering the use, the type of unit that the applicant wanted to use. And so that's kind of why we got to the option that we are today. So I can stop right there. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as some logical, because my thought is that why can't we use a different model and get something that's custom for that space? Like, wouldn't that make sense?
But, excuse me, can I interrupt?
Sure.
I think Mr. Fay pointed out that this intercom is now on the wrong side, or the difficult side of the door, but the door opening device, the handle is there, it's on the left side. So the intercom would now be convenient to the person trying to get into the place, rather than having his backside to the door handle. So I don't see any problem with the proposal. My question is, in fact, I support this proposal, but I don't understand what has to be patched in the existing condition. Can you explain that, Mr. Fay?
So once the new, with the new intercom up and running, I mean, this one hasn't functioned in God knows how long.
Yeah, I know, but how are you gonna patch it when you take it away?
Right, well, we're gonna do it as carefully as possible. If we need a mason to come in and patch the brownstone, we'll do that. I mean, we'll have our carpenter come out and refinish anything as needed, but we'll kind of have to see what if there's any damage after this has been taken down.
On the left side, there's a smaller plate. Does that come off too?
Yes, that would come off too.
And is that recessed into is that cut into the door, or is that just applied to the surface?
That's just applied to the surface.
But
And the box below it with the key?
I'm not positive.
that's a fire department key box, I suspect, or the mailbox key box that probably would remain. It's not associated with the intercom.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
I went and looked at it yesterday. It's one of those, the mailman gets the key out of that. Usually that's what those typically are.
So you still have that on that side?
Yes, if that's for the mail carrier, then that would stay.
The big thing on the right side of this image is attached to the masonry, not to any wood.
It looks like there might be at least 1 or 2 screws into the wood.
Well, anyway, you could be able to patch it, right? Yeah. Okay, I get it. Thank you.
And Mo, we can make that part of the provisos of the approval if needed.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's the end of my comments. Thank you.
Ralph, did you want to add something?
I was just going to concur with what Mo had said. I think, overall, I'm in favor of this. I think to make sure the brass box covers the new component appropriately, and the old one is removed and things are patched up. That's the only proviso I had.
All right. Well, before we even get to provisos, we have to get to the public. But Ralph had his mic off. So Ralph, did you want to add something?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't.
All right. All right. So the commissioners seem to have had a conversation. Let's hear what the public has to say. We have Holland Lord with his hand up.
Holland, go ahead.
Thank you. We do not oppose the video intercom provided it is behind a brass cover to satisfy guideline E7, which states lighted or backlit buzzers and intercom panels shall not be allowed. Thank you.
All right, and we've got Robert Whitney with his hand up next.
Go ahead, Robert. Rob.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Sorry. I'm having trouble finding the button. I was curious how many units were in the building. I couldn't see anything on the application.
There's 5 units.
Is there a reason why you're using a butterfly unit for 5 simple units? Couldn't you just simply have a brass plate with a camera, which is, I think is what you want, with 5 buttons? They're easily available online. I could buy one tomorrow. Is there a reason why? Because if you used a brass, polished brass plate with 5 buttons with which has an intercom, which has a camera, you would not need the butterfly unit. You wouldn't need the brass cover. And also, following from Commissioner Allen's comments, you could leave it where it was because it would be relatively small, and it would not require you to basically cut a new hole in the facade of the entrance, which I know generally is discouraged by putting a new hole in existing infrastructure. So I'm just curious, did you look into getting a more simple intercom system since there's only 5 units?
The trustee did look at a number of different vendors and companies. The functionality of the butterfly system was definitely part of why they opted to go with this company. There's a decent amount of, 5 units, but a lot of dog walkers and other, more than 5 people coming in and out of the building on a given day. So it was just the features really is I think why they ended up going with the butterfly model.
Okay. Seems to me it's unnecessary, and it adds additional unnecessary cuts into the existing panel of the building. But thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.
Not seeing any other public comment, Arian, so back to you.
All right, so that's the end of the public comments. Commissioners, what are your thoughts? Does anyone have a proposal? Does anyone want to make a motion? Let's hear.
Make a motion to accept it as presented.
Anyone want to second that motion?
Second,
Now, as far as the filling in of the hole in the masonry, is that something that, Nick, you would be able to make sure that they do everything correct?
Yes, but I would recommend that that's part of the approval, to make sure that the conditions are restored after the existing unit is removed, and also indicate that the old unit should be removed.
All right, do you want to put that proviso in, Commissioner Feingold?
I accept that as a friendly amendment.
All right, so the friendly amendment is that under the proviso of removing the old unit, filling it with appropriate material, and making sure that staff can have a look at it, that everything's done correctly. All right, and we're gonna second that motion now.
second,
All right, fantastic. Let's go with the vote. Commissioner Feingold,
Aye.
Commissioner Fleck,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
aye.
and we've got me, Commissioner Allen, and I say aye. Am I missing anyone?
I think you got everyone.
Fantastic. All right, well, then Nick and the staff will follow up with you, and they'll send you the letter saying that you may move forward. This has been approved.
Okay, great. Thank you to all the commissioners.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's bring back our chairman.
There he is. I'll text him just in case.
Thank you very much,
Oh, there he
Arian.
is.
Sorry for the short notice. Sorry, I was muted. Next on the agenda is 94 Mount Vernon Street, I believe. 94 Mount Vernon. Mark Van Brocklin. Mark, I think I saw you. I think. Yes, there he is. Mark, you want to just raise your hand in the Zoom so Nick can find you on the and unmute you? Let's see, Nick, and then there's Mark, and then John's iPad. Can we unmute them?
Thank you.
There we go. There's Mark. And also, do you see John's iPad? Johnny, Mark, is John part of the team here? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. John Moran is a counsel for our client for this project.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead, Mark? We'll bring in John if we need to. Nick can unmute him. You want to just give us a quick summary of what you are proposing?
Sure thing. Thank you, Mark. I'm Mark Van Brocklin in Mark Design with the architecture team for 94 Mount Vernon Street, which we've been before you a couple times as the project is progressing. Today we have two items. One is to propose to paint the new windows on the front facade in off-white color. They were previously approved administratively to be replaced in kind. The previous windows were painted black. We're proposing to paint the windows off-white, which is the top white color there. The second item is a proposed roof deck. And there's going to be a lot of, we've had quite a bit of feedback, and we've been responding to that on the size, location, et cetera, of the railing of that roof deck. I have some graphics I can share that are literally hot off the press an hour ago that nobody's seen. We've revised the mock-up a couple times, et cetera. So should I present all that, or do we want to separate the two topics to keep it clean, or?
I suspect the roof deck will require a lot more discussion than the paint. So why don't we start with what may be probably the easier one, which is the paint colors. You've got a nice diagram here. So it's the chip on the top, and it's going to be let's see, all of the window trim on the front facade, and anything else.
No, just to clarify, previously approved the entry surround, which is currently that dark brown, almost black color, was approved to be ash shade gray, which is the bottom right chip, sort of a darker taupe. The paneling inside was previously approved to be the off-white. The door is wood, will be restored. What we're coming to you today is just the 11 windows, the 8 in the brick and the 3 in the mansard, to be painted the off-white color. The 2 windows in the granite base would be black.
Okay.
And the shutters would be black as well.
Okay, just to be clear, the ones at the lowest level in the granite, are they black now? So you're
Yes.
just okay, so that's in kind, and then the rest, the off-white shown in the upper right here, which is called classic gray. Okay. Let's see, we actually just had a discussion about paint colors, obviously, if you were tuned in at the
Yes.
time. Can you give us, you probably heard the sort of preamble to that, but we generally will ask for paint colors to have some historical relationship to the history of the building. Again, not necessarily requiring that the color have been on the building at some part of its history, but that the color be consistent with the period of the building, either when it was built or its later modified style and so forth. Can you give us a little background about the motivation for the off-white color?
Motivation is obviously just aesthetic preference. We don't have any evidence of what the windows were originally. I suspect, as you talked about in the earlier presentation, that this might have been refreshed sometime after the turn of the 19th century, to be more modern and painted black at that point. I'm not sure about that. Shades of off-white were generally common for the period of this building. The list of historic New England has a bunch of colors, some of which are off-whites and creams. But beyond that, I don't have much historical evidence.
Sure. And remind us the date of this building, if you know it.
It's 1885, I believe.
Right.
I suspect the mansard is newer.
Uh,
Nick. Nick, do you want to correct me?
Macris has 1835 Greek Revival, which would make sense for it to be a Greek Revival style, which the color that is being proposed is in fact a color. This was the off-white. Yeah, that is an appropriate color for Greek Revival, Mark, based on the
Yeah,
the historical
indeed, and
information.
that's what I would have thought for the date. Mark, for what it's worth, I suspect if you're seeing a date of 1880, that would be consistent with that mansard addition, which was clearly not original to this building. So, okay, I think
If I may add, that
yeah.
is also consistent with adjoining buildings of similar style and age.
Indeed, and it just in terms of trying to get the right period of reference for this is actually a pretty other than that mansard a pretty remarkably unadulterated facade for a building in the 1830s. So it's a very fine building. Okay, commissioners, any other clarifying questions about just with respect to the paint? I don't think I hear any. We can come back, of course. Okay. And then why don't we go ahead and tell us about the roof deck? Well, let's start with what's in the application, and then just if you've modified it already since you submitted it, why don't you just quickly get to that? Oh yeah, thank you there, John. There's some supporting information about other nearby buildings. But I think we're probably going to be comfortable with the paint color. So why don't we go on to the roof deck?
Great, Mark. Are you suggesting I share my new material or go through what's in here?
Let's start since I know you had a mock-up out there. I have looked at the mock-up, so I'm aware of what you can see from where for the way it was at least originally proposed. So it would be helpful to just talk about that for a moment in case other commissioners have seen it, so that we can then get a sense for how you have changed it since then. So why don't you just give us a quick overview of what's in the proposal at the moment?
Okay, what's in the proposal?
As you had it.
This is probably the first iterations of a very large roof deck close to the facade, 8 foot setback. The original iteration also had a 42-inch railing, which by code we can go down to 36. So if this represents the first iteration, the mock-up that you saw up through yesterday is the second iteration, which was slightly smaller than what's in this drawing. A third iteration we presented to the Civic Association Monday, and then after some engineering, we got the fourth iteration, which I'll get to in a moment. So the proposal, as shown, is a roof deck with a black metal railing, a head house for access of the roof deck. I will note that there's a couple items on here that are not under review that were in the package regardless. For example, the rear deck is on the first level off of Acorn Street, not visible. And there's some trees that weed trees we want to get rid of. So the roof deck, as shown, is large, and we've got a head house here. We are not asking for a head house. That is not part of our proposal anymore officially as of right now. And then we've revised the size of the deck. So if it makes, I'm not sure if we need to see any more of the older material. Or actually,
that was helpful for context. Yeah, just one quick question, and forgive me, I think you said it as much already, but the one I would have seen now about 4 days ago, let's say, approximately, which iteration was that was mocked up? Is that what we're looking at here?
No, so I think our drawings and mock-up got out of sync. We mocked up this, and we were we saw how bad it was, so we pulled it back. So that mock-up, the mock-up of what's in this drawing would have existed for 15 minutes. So what we're seeing now is actually, I'm sorry, they don't have the drawing here. It's actually, instead of the 8 feet, it's 14'6" setback. Sorry, 12'6". That's what you're seeing here in the picture.
Okay, that's setback how far in the picture?
12'6", and this hasn't been modified. And I have in my new materials, I've got some before and after pictures, which I think would be much more helpful.
Yeah, let's go to that. Thanks.
Okay. Can I share?
Yep. Hang on one second, Mark.
Sure thing. Thank you. And this is all rapidly moving, and I apologize it's not clear, but I appreciate your patience with us as we
Sure.
are trying to do the right thing for everybody. Okay, so can you see my? Looks like you can see my screen.
Yes, thank you.
So the revised roof deck is set back 14'6" as of today, which is 2 feet farther back from the mock-up you've seen. I think the next drawing might be more helpful. So here's the overall sort of sightline study, which I'll just zoom in. So the red dimensions, the 12'6" and 5 feet 3/4 inch high, that's the mock-up you would have seen recently. And I'm measuring that just from the edge of the mansard to the height of the railing. We have done some internal engineering to sink the roof deck into the roof with some new framing. We haven't done any of this work, but we figured out that we can do this and pull the roof rail back 2 feet from the face of the building and drop it 1'9", which is this dimension here. So the new mock-up is 21 inches lower and 24 inches farther back than what you would have seen.
Okay. And by the way, in this drawing, Mount Vernon Street is on the left?
Correct. Yes,
Okay.
Mount Vernon on the left, Acorn to the right.
Got it. Okay. And
So-
again, just for clarity, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
The pitched roof structure we see in the back is the neighboring building, right? So your building, the roof is in the gray. Basically, the railing is proposed guardrail painted black. That's yeah, where you're pointing right now. That's your roof. Okay, got it.
Correct. Yes, it's a shallow roof on top of the mansard. Number 92 Mount Vernon is taller with a large glass door on the front.
Right.
So,
okay.
Not having the luxury of seeing the new mock-up, I've got a couple of series of photos here just to try to illustrate. So on the left, from Pinckney Street, and I've got a zoom in a second, which I know is more helpful. You can see the mock-up, the top rail, which is this black line in the sky here. As of the mock-up revision, it's lowered 21 inches, which you can see there on the right. So this is the distant view from Pinckney, not zoomed in. And Lewisburg Square being private, we didn't take photos from there. So at a zoomed in level, previous mock-up, and you see these verticals here, that's the head house, which we are no longer proposing. This top line is the previous front roof rail, and the middle line is the rear roof rail, I believe, which is in the revision. You only see the top rail of the front rail here. And I will point out that there's an existing skylight hatch, which is kind of propped open in here. That's what this is. Mm-hmm. Our new proposal would be a new access hatch to the roof deck, which would be beyond and not visible. So if we get if a roof deck is approved, this hatch would go away from the visibility.
Okay. And what about the side rail, which you can see just the corner of it or a little piece of it in the left, and you don't see it on the right?
Yes, in the current mock-up, it is visible slightly from down Mount Vernon. We haven't addressed that directly, but we are happy to pull that. That'll be much easier to make that less visible, pulling it into the building, which we're open to do. But that was the less critical of the topics, meaning that's easier for us to address, and I didn't get to that.
Okay. But let me just ask a general question about the side railing. I think I understood from the prior drawing that the front of the roof deck would be at the corner of that chimney, and there's another chimney. I'm not sure if it's on your drawing, but it may be on the adjacent building. But I'm just wondering that. It sounds like if you're sinking the roof in, the side rail would be lower, but also perhaps it wouldn't be as long a railing because it's pulled back.
I believe so, and I believe there are a front chimney and a rear chimney on the wall between 94 and 96.
Okay,
so the rail between those would be narrower.
let me just ask the direct question. I think, candidly, we're gonna have to go look at this again, I think, because the mock-up has been modified, but the current mock-up will also show that side railing in its currently proposed position?
I believe so. I will confirm that with the contractor. And Nick, if it's not by tonight, I'll let you know when it will be.
Okay, great. Okay.
Just to let me just finish.
Sure.
I just do, just have to point out that there's a number of recently approved railings quite visible from either the square or other public areas. And then my closing sort of volley to the discussion is to, if the railing is visible, we we know that, but in the greater context of either the square, it's really a minimal part of the skyline and part of the view. Being adjacent to a much taller building with that sort of tall, like I call it an airy, the glass dormer on top of 92. We think it's a pretty minimal effect on the overall feeling of the viewscape.
Mark, Commissioner, if I may add, your guidelines suggest that you consider the architectural features of other buildings involved. And the demising wall has a rather elaborate and massive chimney, which belongs to 92 and not the applicant's building. And the dormer is a rather massive glass-faced dormer. And I would suggest that this combination of architectural features of the adjoining building would tend to mitigate the effect of the long view of the railings. Also, at our meeting with the Beacon Hill Civic Association, a member made the observation that the railing would be visible only in the winter, that for most of the year, the trees would screen the view of the railing and of the building. I think that combination of the long view railing visibility, the commission should consider the annual view plus the dominant features of the adjoining structures on 92. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I think bottom line with this, Mark, is this is the view that's let's just call it for the moment the most problematic. It is somewhat distant, but at least the way it was originally mocked up, it has one characteristic that we really try to avoid historically. So we certainly have a guideline with respect to roof decks, and the guideline, posits that roof decks and roof deck railings that or enclosures that can be seen from a public way are inappropriate to the historic district. There's what the guideline says, of course, and how it's been applied in practice. And it's not hard to find visible roof decks all over the neighborhood. Of course, some of those predate the historic district or the later additions to the historic district. There's probably, some that were never approved in the first instance, and others that were approved. And what we try to do, certainly in practice, is minimize the visual impact of anything that would change the architecture of the building. And we have a couple of principles. They're not hard fast rules, but they're principles that we try to use to guide our deliberations about roof decks. And one of them, which is kind of implicated here, is we have historically made a distinction when adjudicating applications for visible roof deck railings. Again, beyond trying to make them as minimally visible as possible, we've made a distinction between those that simply are going to be in front of other architectural features, and in particular, making note when they're in front of other, let's just say, undistinguished architectural features, just like a piece of brick wall or something like that, as distinct from those that are set against the open sky, because the visual impact, we think, is greater. They're more noticeable, and that contributes more to the overall architecture of the building when it's set against the open sky versus against unremarkable architectural features. It doesn't obscure something of historical significance or architectural import to the building. This particular instance, you've got, I think, that challenge. The railing would be seen against the open sky, and so even though, and I think this image actually demonstrates, why we make this distinction, because even at this much remove, an entire block away, it's still quite noticeable. I could see it quite plainly from that vantage point. And so that's why we're concerned about this. We certainly appreciate very much the efforts that you've already undertaken to try to reduce or minimize that visibility. And I think, given that we have not had a chance to see the mock-up yet, and I think we'd be reluctant to make a decision based simply on the drawings and the renderings. They're quite helpful, but we're kind of not doing our due diligence if we don't go out and look at it and really get a sense for it. We're probably going to need to take another crack at this after we've had an opportunity to do that.
Commissioner, if I may add, in your deliberations on the project at 9 Park Street, the Union Club, which the railing was visible long and short view, and yet in the wisdom of the board, it was approved. Here we are attempting by cutting into the existing roof in attempts to modify the visibility. I think that should be a consideration. Plus, as the board member of the Civic Association mentioned, the view is going to be blocked most of the year by the trees in the park.
Right. As I said at the outset, it's you're correct to observe that it's not like we've never approved a visible roof deck railing. But we have some principles by which we adjudicate applications for things like that, and the Union Club example is relevant certainly for this purpose. That was also visible to a certain degree from some remove, albeit from in that instance even from the Boston Common. So we're not saying no. We're saying we're saying we need to see what the impact of these modifications are on the visibility and the visual impact, because it's just, I think I personally wouldn't be comfortable making a decision based on the revised drawings and renderings or photographs, as helpful as they are. Commissioners, in light of all that, any further clarifying questions about the proposal at the moment for the roof deck on the top of the building? There's another proposal for a roof deck on the L, which we'll want to just address briefly, but any other questions about the roof deck proposed as it's currently proposed on the top of the building?
I have one.
Sure, Commissioner Feingold, please.
It's sort of an out of order question, but you proposed making a little recess in the roof. How are you going to deal with drainage from that well?
There'll be an internal roof drain. There'll be tapered insulation under the roof deck and an internal roof drain with an overflow, which is typical. And that'll tie into the stormwater recharge system.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this has been done before. And let me just on that point, since it might come up, I think you've as much as answered it and shown us in the diagram, but just to be clear, the visual impact of that recess into the roof into which you would propose to put the revised version of the deck is not going to affect the roof line as it's seen from the street? In other words, the top of that mansard is still the top of that mansard?
Correct. The mansard is it's slate on the mansard with a gutter, and then from that gutter back is a black rubber roof, which is not visible. It's beneath the slope is less than the view here.
Right. And by the way, John, to your prior comment, you mentioned, or one of you mentioned, that there were, you felt some relevant precedents of other things that had been approved. In the interim, we're going to go look at this again, I think, but at your revised mock-up again. But by all means, if you have specific knowledge of specific roof decks that you understand were indeed approved by this commission, and you want to supply us with the addresses of those buildings, we'll look at those. You might think we can just whip those out quickly. But it would require actually a little bit more effort than you might think to find them. So if you have specific examples that you wanted to draw our attention to, we'd certainly welcome that. Particularly those that you're asserting were indeed approved. Okay, so you're not going to alter the roof line in the proposal, which is important. Another aspect of this. Can we talk then about the one on the okay, so commissioners, just to be clear, at the moment anyway, or not at this moment, but in the original proposal, the side of the railing on the top roof deck was visible in the mock-up from below on Mount Vernon Street. Do you happen to have an image of that? Forgive me, Mark, you may have already said that you don't, but
I don't have an image of the revised mock-up from Mount Vernon. I don't know if that was modified. I'm going to confirm with the contractor.
Okay, so commissioners, just for our purposes, since I think we're probably going to need to look at this again, I would just draw your attention to the fact that this is visible from two locations. This is Pinckney Street at Lewisburg Square. We're looking straight down the square, and it's the building at the very back there on Mount Vernon. And then if you turn right on Mount Vernon and go down a few houses and look up, you would have seen previously the side railing. And so I just want to draw your attention to that in terms of looking at the revised mock-up, because we're not seeing that portion of it here, but it's also, or it was also visible. Okay, so the portion on the back, so there's a rear L on the house that backs up to Acorn Street, which is also private. And now the back portion of this is at least visible from the public way at Willow Street. But can you tell us about
Commissioner, I think Nick determined that it was not visible, and
Mark, I think you were looking at the flashing of the roof replacement for the garage that was approved the last time. Is that what you were seeing? Because I don't think this one's visible.
Yeah, I don't think it is either. I just want to affirm that
okay.
for the commission.
Yep.
Forgive me. And the reason is because this deck, this is just a question, forgive me. I just want to make sure I knew what I was looking at when I went out and looked at it. This deck, the L of the building extends all the way to Acorn Street, but the proposed roof deck on top of that L does not. Is that correct?
correct.
Yeah, indeed. So it goes part of the way back, and the distance between the end of the roof deck and Acorn Street is like 18 feet or something. Did I have that right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so the reason you can't see this, so Acorn Street is to the left and Willow Street is below here. It'd be sort of on the bottom of that. The portion, the where this house would be visible from is that intersection of Willow and Acorn. And so if you look diagonally, what you see is the back of the L, but right where the cursor is there, if you just move north a little bit, is the end of the roof deck. So I did not see that. But just to be clear, it's mocked up right now, or it was?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, I did not see that. There is a question. I know the Civic Association's got a comment about whether or not you're changing the sort of roof line at the back of the L. So I'm going to want to ask you about that. I understand it's under construction and so forth, so you may have taken this apart to work on it and so forth. But okay, I think I'm satisfied, and Nick, you're satisfied that the proposed roof deck on the L is not visible.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry to take time on that. I just want to make sure we can just confirm that so we can move on. Okay, and that's it in terms of the proposal at this point, right?
Is that enough?
Yeah.
And I do want to clarify, we do understand that we're coming in late in the game, but I wanted to have this conversation. I know that we're not going to get any decision tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation.
Oh, no, and we appreciate you proactively trying to revise it accordingly. I think, I think we're kind of on the same page of the part that's problematic and the need to address that and see what we can do to mitigate that. I think, let's just put it this way. I think if you would come in with the original proposal, my inclination would have been, I can't speak for my colleagues, but to seek some further, seek some mitigation of the visibility to see what we can do. So I don't know that we would have been in a position to approve it anyway. So we're probably in the same place that we would have wound up anyway, but we're further along in the sense that we've already got a mock-up up there that's been revised, so we can now take a look at that. We've got another month where we might even be able to tweak that further if it seems feasible or warranted or something. But let me just ask commissioners any other questions, because we still need to take public comment on this.
I just think, I thank the applicant for shrinking the size of things to make it much more feasible. Thank you.
I had a question, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman.
Mr. Fleck,
If
please.
there's a continuation in the future here, is it reasonable to defer the public comment piece, or do we want to gather that now?
I'd like to hear it.
as part
Yeah,
of the
I mean, understanding, if you want to make a comment on the record, understand that the proposal is already in the process of being modified. And so if you want to try to influence the further direction of that, by all means, go ahead. Okay, let's go ahead and take public comment. If you want to be heard on the record, please raise your hand using the button probably at the bottom of your Zoom panel. Nick will acknowledge you and unmute you in turn.
Okay, first up is Holland. Holland, go ahead. Go ahead, Holland. Sorry.
There we go. Thank you. Brief caveat. This comment was written not including any revisions since Monday, so take it for what it's worth. The comment is, we oppose the upper roof deck as it is visible from multiple viewpoints, both front and rear, in multiple public ways, and does not satisfy guideline C3. We oppose the lower roof deck because the sloped roof of the rear L has been reconstructed flat, which does not satisfy guideline C1 requiring historic roof lines be retained. We do not oppose the substitution of a hatch and elimination of the head house. We do not oppose the paint color change from black to light. Thank you.
Thanks, Holland. I'm not seeing any other public comment, Mark, so back to you.
Okay, thanks, Holland. So Mark, can I just ask you to, in light of that comment we've just heard from Holland at the Civic Association, I did notice when I went out there, again, I understand it's under construction, and so you may be taking stuff apart to work on it, but Holland had, I think, Holland, if we can maybe get you back here for a second, you had some photographs that you supplied in your written comments.
Is this about the wall on Acorn Street?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So Nick called attention to that. They were rebuilding the roof. What you see here is the existing framing and sheathing, and then remember the history. So they were in the process of re-sheathing the roof, and they just neglected to put the flashing back. So I called the contractor Friday, and on Monday of this week, let me just pull up the picture, the right picture. On Monday of this week, they remedied it. So they, pardon, I wasn't expecting to. Let me try to find the image, but they did put the flashing back on. It looks like it was not installed at the right angle. So it looks like it might be flat, but that was just an error. Apologies, I need to figure out. Nick, did I send you that photo? I just want to make sure.
I could go through my email, but I don't.
Okay, let's I don't know that we need to run this to ground, right? Oh, have you got it?
So this was photo taken Monday. The flashing and trim was put back on where it's supposed to be. It's just not popped back down. So they need to just put it back at the right angle. We are not intending to change the slope of the roof back here. This is what was there before. Here's your Comcast or Time Warner, whatever cable that's as before. And we are not proposing any work to the lower garden wall. It'll be level flat with the cap in place.
Okay, right. And so now that you're showing us, so that the idea is that thing is just sticking up on the end. It'll come down on the left side, so you'll maintain that diagonal slope.
Correct.
And then again, since we're looking at it here, understanding this is already all the way down Acorn Street, so not on the public way, but the back of the roof deck you're proposing for the L is over to the right out of this picture, right?
Correct.
Yeah, 18 feet away, in fact. Okay. Okay, very good. Thank you for clarifying that. That actually was worth another couple of minutes to figure that out. Because that, I
Sure.
appreciate the concern there, Holland. I did see that myself as well. Okay, commissioners, I think in light of the concern that was expressed, I think about the visibility of the roof deck from Pinckney Street and the applicant's efforts to expeditiously revise the plan to try to reduce, mitigate that visual impact and visibility of that roof deck rail. I would move that is there any further comments, questions about that? I think we're moving toward a denial without prejudice on the roof deck to give them leave to or give us time to look at the revised mock-up and so forth.
So moved.
Okay, so and we take a friendly amendment to approve the paint color as submitted?
Absolutely.
Okay, and just to clarify, that was Commissioner Fleck, that's a denial without prejudice with respect to the top roof deck and with the specific for the purposes of allowing the commission to the proponent to revise the design and the mock-up and have the to mitigate the visibility of the roof deck from the public way and have the commission go out and look at it. Okay, is that a fair summary, Ed?
Yes, sir.
Okay, do I hear a second?
Second.
Okay, anything else? Okay, we will vote. Commissioner Allen.
Aye.
Mr. Feingold.
Aye.
Mr. Fleck.
Aye.
Mr. Jackson.
Aye.
And Commissioner Kiefer votes aye. Okay, thanks again for your efforts thus far. And you'll get a letter from Nick just codifying that. We will go out and take a look at the revised mock-up. If you have any further revisions to the plans, I just want to make sure we've got a consistent mock-up and a drawing. So let's just maybe circle back with Nick to make sure we're on the same page with that before we go out and look at it, and he'll confirm that for us.
Certainly, yeah. I'll send the correct drawings, and I'll let Nick know. I'll confirm that the mock-up on the side visible from Mount Vernon is in place before you go out there.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, next is 22 Beacon Street. Do we have a representative from 22 Beacon Street? Who is, I think, Zayad?
Hello, how are you?
Hi, how are you? Thanks for coming in. Do you want to give us a quick summary of what you are proposing?
Yes, so we are here today we're opening a new coffee shop on Beacon Hill. We are here for approval on signing, on the signage, on the awning, on a blade sign and door handles. It was a previous Dunkin' Donuts, and as you can see, that's how the sign looked like with the green awning.
I might have to recuse myself. Perhaps let me know, Nick, because I'm at 21, which is across the
Yep.
street.
You do have to recuse yourself.
All right, gotta keep it honest, guys.
Thank you, Ariane. Appreciate that.
So
Okay.
So
Go
here
ahead.
we are. We have a lot going on, and obviously, you know, some things after being in this meeting, we know how this goes. So let's start with our sign, the bun in the upper left corner.
Sure.
That's our proposed sign. It's in white. It's made out of all the material is on the next slide over. Nick, if you wanted to go there. So our signage is, the dimensions are right there, 36 inches wide, 18 inches in height, and 2 inches in depth. The material is going to be just aluminum paneling with a matte powder coat finish. And the lettering is a raised acrylic or metal letters painted with a satin finish for high visibility. We were told that we wouldn't be able to use any backlight in order to light it up. So we do understand that. It would have to be just a still sign without any lighting. So we've taken that into consideration. We just weren't sure as far as color wise, if white is an approved color with the red exclamation mark. That is something that is obviously our brand colors are white, red, and black. That's what our theme is. So we're trying to implement as much as possible, but also by still maintaining the character of the building with it being historic. So that's what we're at for the sign. So I don't know if you want to discuss one by one and kind of check them off the list and go back, or how you want to handle this.
Sure. So to sum up, it's, am I correct that it is, and it's all, we can see it all here. It's four things, right? It's the sign in the upper left.
Yep.
It's the replacement of the awning from a green one to a red one. It's the blades, the projecting sign on the right, which is sort of the one that sticks out from the building. And then it's the door handles, which are the red exclamation points in the middle. Is that correct?
Correct. So the exclamation point is pretty much our brand symbol. And while we know red is kind of like a popped out color and, you know, it might be an issue, we are willing to work with you and, you know, either make it black or however, wherever the suggestions on your end come from.
Okay. So, and you just told us so that and let me just ask a question on the sign in the upper left, the flat sign.
Yes.
Is it simply individual letters, or is there, because I don't see a,
yeah, it's individual letters, because Dunkin' Donuts before used individual lettering. If you wanted to go back and see how they had it, obviously.
Right.
So we're kind of following the same thing. That's not even our original logo. Our original logo is all one together, but for the sake of the Beacon Hill Architectural Committee, we wanted to keep it kind of the same flow in order to make things easier. So it is individual lettering.
Okay, great. So you had talked about either acrylic or metal. I think we need it to be metal of those two. We generally require natural materials for these kinds of things. And then can we go back to you had that nice drawing that shows the whole thing?
Yes.
Yeah, there. Okay. And now, forgive me if I should have seen it on the sheet you had up a moment ago, but now the projecting sign and this okay. So one more question on the flat sign. It fits entirely within those two pieces of molding.
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. And then the projecting sign now, the one that's black on white, what is that? That's about how big?
That's also metal. So as far as dimensions, the dimensions for it, we weren't quite sure what the approved dimensions are. Around the neighborhood, when we were looking, there's a lot of flags sticking out that are all different shapes and sizes. There's a lot of signage that's coming out of the same way that's all different sizes. So we weren't, sure what the size that we were going to come suggesting. And we were willing to work with whatever is suggested on your end.
Okay, I think it looks fine just looking at it, but you've got the spec sheet on the next page. Can you just show us what the
I don't think any of these specs apply to the projecting sign.
To the projecting sign, no. This is the specs that you see on the left. Those are just for the main sign that we had already talked about. The projecting sign, we don't have any specs for it.
Okay, can you give me just your sense of about how big that is, what you've rendered there?
If I'm gonna have to guess, it's probably gonna be anywhere between like a 6x3.
6 feet?
No. 6. Sorry, not 6 by 3. It's gonna be like 24 inches by, let's say, 12 inches.
Yeah, that should be fine. And since I can't quite see it in the rendering here, how is it mounted?
It would be mounted with two metal, like metal frame. So the whole thing is going to be made out of a kind of metal, and the inside of it would be out of acrylic, and then it would be held together by either metal or any type of, you know, just kind of welding up against the building.
Okay, so, but is there a bracket that it's attached to, is I guess what I'm asking?
Yeah, I believe so. So we're still speaking to the signage people for that specific sign, but we still haven't finalized exactly how it would be mounted onto the building. That's something that we can get to you as soon as possible.
Okay, so just by way of background, we do have specific guidelines with respect to signage. And we are also, the city of Boston has a sign code. The responsibility for regulations under the sign code in the historic Beacon Hill district is delegated to the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission. And in broad strokes, we allow one flat sign, which is your one in the upper left, per business, and then one additional projecting sign, which is your sign in the upper right, per building. There is another commercial or ish space in this building. It's not used right now, but there's no projecting sign for that business and or whatever it was. So I think both of these signs are within the guidelines for signs. And let's see, the awning, a question on that. The awning that's there now is a retractable awning. Would this be a retractable awning or a fixed one?
Yeah, so we're keeping the same exact setup. The only thing that we're changing, because the green material has been ripped off the canvas on top of it. So
Yeah.
right now, like if I don't know if you've seen it in person, it's half ripped off. So we're just gonna remove the existing green, and it's gonna be the same exact thing in red.
Oh, I see. Okay, you're just recovering it. Okay, fine.
Recovering.
Yeah, and the other thing I should just mention, just for your own benefit with respect to how we treat signage, we do, you can see this all over the neighborhood, of course, but we do allow the use of logos and so forth in signage, at least. And so that's not an issue here. They are obviously often modern and because they're representing contemporary brands and businesses and so forth, and that's fine. It's more about the materials and how they're applied and the sign, the size of the signs, the number of signs and so forth that we are most concerned about. So then again, the projecting sign would also be metal, and the lettering, the black lettering on the white, is that simply painted on, or would there be raised letters as applied on there?
No, yeah, it would be painted on. It would not be raised out of the sign at all.
Okay, and no illumination on that sign either, right?
No.
Right, okay. Which brings us to the door handles. We do regulate door hardware, as you might imagine. It's in size, it's modest, of course, but in its contribution to the architecture of otherwise austere old buildings may be disproportionately important. So we actually do think a lot about that. This might be a challenge, I'll just tell you directly, because typically the way we treat door hardware, abstracted for the moment from whether it's a business or a residence or something like that, is just trying to maintain a general historical appropriateness. Again, we're not requiring that you figure out what the door handle would have been on this building when it was first built. This building has been radically modified over its long life, but it is a remarkably important, architecturally significant building going all the way back to 1804. Believe it or not, doesn't look like it necessarily right now. And attributed to Charles Bulfinch, the so-called Amory Tickner House. This is the other side facade, but so I think we're going to want to have a discussion about the door handles. So that's it, right? To recap, it's door handles, it's the two signs, it's the awning, correct?
Correct. And we knew the door handles was going to be the topic of discussion today, so hope we can come to some sort of resolution, but we're open to all kinds of ideas.
Right. I do appreciate the gesture for what it's worth, and they're quite fun and an interesting use, clever use of the branding. But we have our standards and so forth. We'll need to talk about that. Okay. In the interest of time, why don't we go ahead and take public comment on this, and then we'll come back and discuss what we want to do. Again, if you want to be heard on the record, please raise your hand on your Zoom panel, and Nick will call on you and unmute you.
Okay, first up is Holland with the Civic Association. Holland, lost you again. Where'd you go? Oh, there you are. Go ahead, Holland.
All right, thank you. We oppose the blade sign as proposed, as it does not satisfy guideline I6, and the proposed mounting does not satisfy guideline I5. We suggest wood is more appropriate traditional material. The sign should not have internal illumination. The mounting location should not compromise the fluted detailing of a pilaster, but should be installed from a traditional bracket secured to the fascia board. Note, the pilaster fluting detail is not shown in the application mock-up. See our picture in our document. We do not oppose the band sign as proposed, but suggest wood is more appropriate traditional material to satisfy guideline I6. We do not oppose replacing the awning fabric or changing its color, which goes against guideline A2 to replicate visible qualities such as color, but we believe the proposed bright modern red does not satisfy guideline A3 for new work of appropriate detail for traditional design, and suggest a dark historic red color is more appropriate. We feel that branding that should be kept as signage that goes away when the tenant leaves and not extended to altering historic fabric that will remain. It is also unclear from the application illustrations whether the new awning is fixed or will utilize the existing retractable hardware. We oppose the proposed exclamation point door handles as inappropriate, as they do not satisfy guidelines A2, A3, or A5, and represent additional branding signage which does not satisfy guideline I9. Thank you.
Okay, not seeing any other public comment, Mark, so we can close it for this application.
Okay, thank you, Holland. Thanks, Nick. Nick, do you have the con right now? Can you bring up this building in Google Maps?
Yes.
So just with respect to this, the color of the awning, you know, I think as a practical matter, there's literally in the same building, the awning of Suffolk University and Suffolk University's colors next door. So I think we'd be hard pressed to, I think in general, a red color is fine. I think it actually ties this facade together conveniently. The colors of this brand, of the Bond brand, happen to be exactly the colors of this building, as it turns out, the red, the white and black. That's a happy coincidence, I think. So I think I'm not so much troubled by the awning color myself. I'm encouraged to hear that they're just going to reuse the existing hardware. And I think we tend to prefer the retractable type awnings anyway. Holland, if you're still on, the projecting sign and guideline I6, can you tell us a little bit more about what your consternation is about that?
Oh, God.
There we go. The projecting sign I6, materials and workmanship should be of excellent quality and durability, shop drawings. You're talking about the blade sign.
Yes.
Yeah.
We were primarily concerned with the way that it was going to be mounted to that column there, which is fluted and does not have any does not have any markings of prior installments there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. I was not quite following that, and it's even at this level of zoom, it's hard to see the fluting. Okay, that's an interesting point. I think we should think about that. There is some space at the top of the column there, which would still be below the second floor sill. Plenty of room before the second floor sill. That might, you know, you can hang it off of that perhaps instead.
We're definitely willing to do that if that's a possibility.
Yeah, so Ziad, what we're talking about here right now, what you've got is otherwise, I think, frankly, rather elegant in that you're kind of hiding the mounting hardware behind the sign so it doesn't draw attention to itself. Traditionally, the way this is often done, this is a bit of an unusual building. It's a very tall first floor and so forth, but is you just, you know, hang a simple metal bracket that's like an extruded, you know, metal, a square metal rod, maybe 2-3 feet long, and then have a couple of chains hanging down that then hang the sign at a more appropriate height from there. So we could probably do that.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I'd like to object.
Go ahead, Commissioner Jackson.
If you hang it on the column, it's a violation of the column design. if you look to up in the fascia, you can see that there have been someone holds on the surface where there's the Dunkin' Donuts sign is.
Yeah.
That's the location for adding your blade sign. Otherwise, you're I think that's it's just badly bad positioning. You're wrecking the column.
Well, let's see. So you're talking about just so I understand, Ralph, you're saying if we're gonna hang a projecting sign, you'd want to do it from even higher up, above
Yes,
in the freeze there.
From in the Dunkin' Donut freeze.
Yeah, okay. Well, right, that's even cleaner.
Put a bracket, hang the sign, let it drop down below, but it shouldn't, yes, right. It should not be attached to the architecture.
Oh,
Okay.
I think what Ralph is saying, Mr. Jackson, if we center the blade sign with that light that's in the entryway right above it in the middle, and we have the blade sign coming right out of there, that is something that we're willing to do if that's your suggestion.
You can decide on the location along the wall. I'm simply saying that it should go in the Dunkin' Donut band.
No
Yeah.
problem.
Okay. So hanging it from where the cursor is pointing now up there,
Yes.
rather than on the column. We want to try to preserve the nice detail of those columns. Again, this is an unusual facade in a lot of respects. Most of the buildings, they don't go up that high, so that frieze is a bit lower, above the door. But I think that's quite a reasonable suggestion. Anyone else have any thoughts about that? And by the way, the other thing we're trying to do here is, and this is a great point raised by Commissioner Jackson in general. We want to make these things as reversible as possible. I mean, certainly we're not saying we hope any business that comes to Charles Street will have quite a long life and so forth, and be a thriving business and be good for the community and so forth. But we know, they turn over from time to time and so forth. And so to the extent that we can minimize the impact on the building from the addition of signage, because someone else might come along and use this building differently, if it's just a couple of holes up there in that frieze that could easily be filled, if there's no longer a need for a sign, that's much better than drilling into that column, because you're damaging it in the first instance. And then as Ralph said, you're kind of violating that otherwise pretty pure piece of architecture in the front of the building. So, okay, so it sounds like we've got a solution for the projecting sign. Let's talk about the door handles. I think they're not, it'd be hard to argue that they're historically appropriate. I would just note for the record, in this building around the corner, the now closed, or soon to be closed, I'm not sure if it's closed yet, 9 Park Street restaurant does have a door handle that it's a brass door handle in the shape of a 9.
Yes.
So it is
That's where we kind of got our idea from.
like this. It's more sensitive, certainly with respect to the materials, and it probably does candidly benefit from a form that is more naturally classical in its inspiration, maybe than the exclamation point, I might say. But commissioners, what do we think about there? It is. Thank you, Nick. It's also rendered more innocuous, I believe, by that brass black backing plate. I had to stare at it for a moment to even realize it was a 9.
What would you suggest to the exclamation point be in brass?
I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking you guys what you think.
Well, I sort of find the 9 it's functional in that it's representing the address too, right? So if you really want to split hairs, whereas the exclamation point doesn't really provide a function other than brand.
Is the exclamation point, is it a push-pull event, or is it something you have to turn?
The push.
Push.
Yes.
Okay. What about Mo, what do you think about the exclamation point in brass, or is that still too much?
I'd rather have it in red, I guess, than brass. But I think it's kind of,
Likewise.
I love this idea.
it's kind
Yeah,
of,
I mean, I think,
what are we gonna sell in this store? I can't read this sign.
it's a coffee shop.
It's a coffee shop.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
As it's been for some time, but a new one. Yeah, I mean, I think candidly, I mean, again, appreciate the gesture. I think it's otherwise not. I think in any other location, it would be a fun and sensible gesture. But we do care about door hardware, and we do generally want these things to be historically appropriate for the building.
Could I see the current condition? Because it struck me the current
Mark,
door hardware
Mark,
is
how
pretty
can you
heavy.
say that the 9 is historically appropriate?
I'm not arguing that it is. I don't believe I was on the commission when that was approved, so I don't know where that came from.
That was
Yeah,
20 plus years ago. For
no,
sure.
I was simply observing that there is such a thing in nature, as it were, sort of, kind of, on this building. I wasn't using that as a point of justification so much as
Yeah.
just information at this point.
Big slab of brass.
Yeah, maybe it's not as handsome as I thought it was. It's just a slab of brasses.
Yeah, it doesn't
Makes
look
sense.
too good right now, so we were trying to figure out a way, and when we saw the number 9, we wanted to have fun with it a little bit, but at the same time, the fact that it's in and it's not at the street level, it's like kind of the door goes in a little bit, so we kind of felt maybe by hiding it inside, it would be more appropriate, or even if you don't want red, black, other colors to make it hide a little more, we're open to those suggestions, but as I can tell, everyone has the same feeling that we do. It's like they like it, but they don't know whether to approve it or not.
What if it were the exclamation points were on a plate and they were brass? Would that be too far removed from your corporate symbol?
No, we're willing to work with anything that you think will.
Because that's what apparently 9 did.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would look. I'd favor that.
So just to be clear, so you kind of retain the analogous to what number 9 Park did. You'd retain the backing plate, the brass backing plate, and have a brass exclamation point.
Yes.
Right.
Have a brass, or what? Ralph put a brass exclamation, not a red one?
No, I'm going along to get along.
Well, we don't have to do that. But I mean, another alternative might be something that it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be true to the brand exactly, but might evoke the idea, which is, so right now there's two brass push plates and it looks like some kind of escutcheon for a key or something, right?
Yeah, it's for a key.
Yeah. You can imagine a more traditional brass handle above that, such that, and replicated on the other side, even though you don't need it, right? So just a push handle that is vertical in nature and similar proportions, with the escutcheon below it, which would evoke the exclamation point.
I think what the exclamation points out is that the symmetry is really lovely. Rather than, as it's shown now, that you have a plate on one side and not on the other.
Yeah, so that's what I was suggesting, Ralph. So imagine you take the plates away and you have the existing escutcheon that's there, or key, whatever it is. Maybe we go back to that, Nick, the Google Maps view, and just zoom in on that. Yeah, so get rid of the brass plates, keep the key thing, the escutcheon there, and mount above it a more traditional, just brass pull handle that's maybe, curved, and then replicate it on both sides. so that you've got a vertical brass handle and a scutcheon below, which is kind of evoking the exclamation point.
What's the horizontal brass plate, please? Is that a mail slot?
Below that looks, no, that is not a main, that just a visual thing only.
Oh,
Yeah.
So
The
that
mat.
goes away. Yeah.
and how about the kick plates? Are you going to have brass kick plates?
That's we were planning on keeping that bottom the same for the kick plates. We had no plans of changing anything there. So I think the suggestion of doing the exclamation points in brass to kind of match the theme of the brass is a good suggestion. It just whether or not it's something that you would approve.
Trying to find an example to give you a better sense of what I'm talking about. Yeah, I don't know, maybe we need another bite at the apple here, because I don't know that we can design this on the fly here. Yeah, maybe it's as simple as that. Sorry, Mo, did you have it?
No, I just think he should come, but listen to us and come back with the proposal.
Yeah, okay. I think that's kind of where we're headed. Anyone think differently about that? I think we can give them some guidance.
I just had one more question.
Yes, please, Mr. Fleck.
Comparing the schematic in the submittal versus the current state picture, there's a drop pendant light in that inset. Yeah, that's not shown on the proposal. Was the intentions I had to retain the existing light, which matches the one next door, or were you going to remove that?
No, we're keeping those lights the same. It just the company that did this for us just didn't include it. But
Understood.
yeah,
that's great. Yeah, I
that's
just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Okay,
Which
so
speaks more to a traditional set of hardware, because you're going to have that sort of colonial looking drop pendant, and to have something, super edgy.
Yeah.
I think, might be a bit of a clash. So I think where we're heading, the recommendations seem to be a little more harmonious.
So for us, we want to come to a resolution when it comes to the handles today. Like if we leave this meeting and have to come back for just the handles, we definitely don't want to do that. If something that you cannot approve today, we would rather just get rid of it, keep what we already have, and kind of move forward. It is a cool idea, but we are aiming to open in the beginning of May. So that's just something that we wanted to kind of figure out so we can move forward with the signage and the awning and everything. So as far as the door handles, it's not something that we're really like, being very sticklers about. If it's
right.
prove it, you prove it, you don't.
You can always come back later and change out the door.
Yeah,
handles, 6 months from now.
just to confirm, just to clarify, we're only thinking about needing to come back for the door handle. We can approve the other stuff today.
Great. Okay.
So in other words, you can just leave it as it is and open the shop and use the door the way it is. But if you've got an alternative that you can come back with, where you say, well, we still would like to make the door better, and let's try a revised version of this, you'd be free to do that.
Amazing. So what I'll do after this is I'll go back to our designer and we'll mock up a few other ideas, and we'll come back to the door, and everything else we'll move forward on.
Okay, well, and we'll give you some specific guidance as to what we want to see reflected in the revised design. So with that in mind, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, excuse me for interrupting. The blade sign is still in question, is it not?
Yeah, so that was my next question. Zad, the other thing we're going to need, because we're now, we've moved in the direction of mounting the blade sign from the frieze, that is to say at the same level as what's now the Dunkin' Donuts sign and will soon be your new sign. So we need to see the details of the bracket. Obviously, you're not going to want to stick it straight out from there, or at least I assume that we're talking about a bracket that would extend, and then you'd hang the sign from the bracket. So we're going to need to see that detail. Nick, let me ask you, what would if we specified to the maximum extent possible what we have in mind for that, which is, I think, a very simple black metal bracket that would extend, like 1 inch, square metal or something, projecting from the building, and hung on black chains or something like that. Would you be comfortable having the final commissioners in the first instance, but also Nick, would we be comfortable delegating that to staff?
I think that's fine, because I think there's a couple examples that we can point to, like, I think the sevens is a good example without the
yeah.
detail. Yeah.
I
So-
also have an example to show you if you would like me to show you, Mark. It's literally right next door to us. There's a perfect example of how that blade sign should be hung, and if that's something that you would like us to show you, we can.
Okay.
So if you go to the left,
Of
Chocolate shop,
yeah, I can share my screen if you'd like.
Colette.
Right there.
Yeah, that's ostensibly what we have in mind. Now, your sign is your bracket's gonna be higher up, so, you know, obviously, we need to know how low the sign is gonna hang and so forth. That one is hung right off the sign. The ones on Charles Street that are higher, you know, just have some chains. Another example might be the Charles Street Meeting House, which has a whole run of these. Yeah, actually, Nick, if you wouldn't mind bringing that up, that's a good example. Because it's got 5 of them in a row, and they're kind of the signs are hung. So yeah, see, it's just a simple metal black
Yes.
thing, and it's a little hard to see, but they're black chain, so forth. Okay, so sounds like Nick is okay doing that. Commissioners, if we give them some guidance and then just specify that the final design would be reflective of something like this to be approved by Nick, are you comfortable with that? Approving that today?
I am.
Yes.
I had
Ralph,
one
is that-
question, and I wanted Ralph to weigh in on this. With, not to violate the column, but with the bracket so high and the chains presumably so long, is an alternative to consider a bracket or a piece of steel that projects out from the column but fastened to the side of the column, so almost an cantilever kind of a configuration that hides, you know, doesn't require the big L-shaped bracket, but is projecting out and above the fluting where you have the plain flat surface on the column. Does that, because then you'd have 6 or 7 inches of chain instead of 2-3 feet of chain, and would that be a cleaner look? But I don't want to violate the column, as you had pointed out, because it is a beautiful structure.
I fundamentally question the necessity of the blade.
I'm sorry?
Well, I mean, they're kind of allowed it under the guidelines.
I know that they're, but in this case, is it really necessary to have the blade sign?
Well,
If you'd like me to answer that, I could. The only reason is because when people are walking on the street, they don't see our sign from across the street, the blade allows the customer or the consumer to see what's there. So if it says Bon Coffee Shop, it's a different way of showing whoever's walking on the same side of the road. That's all.
So, Marcus, I think if you are going to design something differently than the typical examples, you need to show us that. I'm opposed to using the column as a source of support.
Well, okay, Ed,
Fair enough. No, that answers my question. Thank you, Ralph. I
But
appreciate
Ed,
that.
Ed, are you okay with the version we had before the suggestion?
Yeah, I wasn't opposed to it. I was just trying to come up with perhaps
Sure.
a more
I appreciate that.
low profile kind of but I do appreciate, you know, this is the one piece of the proposal that has nothing other than the graphical representation in the drawing, in the photo illustration. There's no specifications, there's no shop drawings or anything. So, you know, maybe those two components might have to be suggested that they come back with more details to review, whereas the awning and the panel sign could proceed. I don't know, because there's very little information to go on.
And it feels like the bracket can be in the fascia, but you want the sign below the fascia.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yes,
No,
yes. Oh,
right.
yeah, absolutely.
And that I would stipulate that's part of what Nick would approve. He's going to
That's
show
fine.
us the bracket, the chains, and where the sign goes below the
I just
ground.
know, historically, we've been persnickety about the material, the letters, are they applied? There's a lot of detail to those blade signs that we've traditionally been
Right.
particular about, and
Well,
I'm not suggesting that's wrong. Just for
yeah.
consistency, it might be good to have that clarity, and if we want to defer that to Nick, I'm fine doing that, but usually we have a lot more line of sight to what the finished product's going to be.
Well, let's put it this way. I'm planning in the motion to
Mine.
stipulate that the materials and that the shop drawing and final specifications be submitted for approval to staff before it's installed.
No problem.
That's fair.
That's
Okay.
a very fair ask, and that's something I think we should go back and do anyways, and come back for the door and the blade sign with the exact specifications, exact location was going to be based off of your feedback. But for now, the main sign and the awning, those are the main things that we definitely wanted to move forward with. So we're definitely good with the suggestions on that.
Okay, great. So I will move then that the application be approved in part with the following provisos, that a belt sign, a flat sign be, letters be made of metal, that the projecting sign be installed using a simple metal bracket, similar to those currently in place on the Charles Street Meeting House and other locations, similar design, a simple metal bracket, square metal bracket, and to be installed in the frieze at the same height or location as same height on the facade as the belt sign and not in the column, and that the sign be hung with black metal chain from the bracket, and that the final design, that the projecting sign be made of metal, and that the final specifications of the projecting sign, the exact specifications and design of the bracket and chain, and its dimensions and all the dimensions, as well as final shop drawings, be submitted to staff, and their approval delegated to staff for final approval in advance of any installation, and that the application be denied without prejudice with respect to the door handles, and the applicant asked to provide revised designs using more historically appropriate hardware and materials, specifically meaning hardware made in brass and using designs, historically appropriate designs, period.
Mr. Chairman, I think you left out the awning.
Yes, it's and approved with respect to the awning, approved as submitted. Thank you. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Okay, we will vote. Commissioner Allen.
She's recused.
Oh, thank you. So we'll vote. Commissioner Feingold.
Aye.
Commissioner Fleck.
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson.
Aye.
Commissioner Kiefer votes aye. Thank you very much, Ziad. You will get a letter from Nick summarizing our determination, and feel free to just follow up with him directly. He can give you some more direct guidance about exactly what that sign bracket needs to look like and the kinds of things that we would more favorably entertain with respect to the door hardware. He can point you some specific examples of what we're talking about and that kind of thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate
Take
it.
care. Bye.
Okay. And finally,
Sorry, Mark. Off screen.
okay, so finally, we do have one final item for advisory review. This is 155, 159 Charles Street. Just a heads up, this is just an advisory review, so we will not be making a determination on this. It's not an application yet. It's just an advisory review. So Nick, I believe we're not taking public comment. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
It's your call, but typically speaking, we do not take public comment for advisory review items.
Okay. So if you are members of the public, if you are interested in this, again, at some point, they will come before us with a formal application, and of course, we'll take public comment at that time. But in the meantime, based on what you hear in tonight's discussion, by all means, if you have views that you would like to express about this, by all means, submit them in writing to Nick at any point. Thank you. Okay, do we have a representative from I think it's Alex from Road, if I'm saying that correctly? I think I saw up there.
Yep. And Mark, I think we should probably limit the presentation to about 15 minutes, and then you can give them about 15, 20 minutes of comments. Does that
Yes, sounds
to you?
good.
Okay.
Okay. So just as a very quick preamble here, this, just to orient us here, the address might not be obviously familiar to everyone. 155 to 159 Charles Street is the location of the what is currently the CVS building at the far end of Charles Street, where it intersects Cambridge Street across from the Charles Street T station. So with that, and this is a proposal to ostensibly replace that building. This is an advisory review, and again, we would expect ultimately a formal application for this. And I just want to note for the record that this is within our jurisdiction. There might have been some question about this a year ago, but of course, with the expansion of the historic district boundary to include the southern side of Cambridge Street, this is now squarely within our jurisdiction, and so this is ripe for our consideration. So with that, the folks from Road, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what you have in mind? Thank you.
Sure. Good evening, Nick. This is Eric at Road Architects. Can you allow us to share?
You got it.
Thank you. There we go.
All right. And just a reminder, guys, just about 15 minutes, okay?
Yeah, I will push through quickly, so thank you. Good evening, Commissioner, members of the commission. We're super excited to be here. I am Eric Robinson. I'm principal owner of Roadie Architects. I'm joined with Ruthie Kuhlman, who is our project manager for this project. And I think there was a note of Alex Z, who's also on the team. And unfortunately, William Young, who's our historical consultant, was holding on, but he had something he had to go to at 7. So he unfortunately had to drop off the call. But with that, I will move forward through our presentation. So as noted, this is the re-envisioning of the CVS site on the corner of Charles and Cambridge Streets. We fully understand the aspect of this in terms of its gateway moment into the Beacon Hill area. We have been working on this project now for about 2 years plus, with a series of actually really great community meetings, abutter meetings, abutter walks. It's been so far an amazing sort of process, which we've really enjoyed. It's really highlighted a lot of the ideas and thoughts from the neighborhood, and we think where we are today, which is still along the pathway, is really a reflection of that process. So we're excited to be part of this project. Ageria, who is the ownership group, is actually the recent owners of and purchasers of the Whitney Hotel. So you can see the little diagram on the right. And they also own the adjacent building where the Beacon Hill Cleaners is at 151. So Ageria now owns basically this sort of corner and entry sequence into Charles Street. So it's important for them to make sure that they are caretaking this moment as well, as they become owners and caretakers of the neighborhood. So, you know, as we see this site as a pivot site or a corner site to really 2 different districts in terms of how they appear on Charles Street and Cambridge Street. And so as we were trying to understand a little bit of the history of the site, we looked and saw how we learned how this place has obviously become over time, where it used to be a mid-block site, and then it revealed itself over the time and history, and then created the shape and its relationship to obviously the T station and the circle, and then how that has evolved over time in terms of some of its uses, as you can see in the bottom right with the connecting stair from the elevated stair from the train at Charles. We've also taken note and done a lot of walking and understanding of the district itself, and trying to make sure we understand the prominence of this corner site and location. We've looked at the opposite end of Charles Street and wanted to understand what that gateway moment looks like and feels like, and you can see the slide in the middle. And then really thinking about this condition at the corner and what it currently is now, as you can see from moving from left to right on the bottom slide from the top shelf building, and then dropping down to the CVS store. Obviously is a one store. You see the building behind with Silver Place between, and then the Whitney anchoring the other side corner of Charles Street. Really an interesting moment for us to think about as designers within this new space. Just some existing photos of the current site, which I'm sure everybody knows very well. But for us, it's important to think about all the aspects that are happening here. We know it's a very busy corner from a pedestrian point of view. And so making sure that we're thinking and understanding of how traffic moves through here in terms of pedestrian traffic. And that was a lot of the conversations we had as we walked with some of the community members and really are learning more about this space at the street plane and what it means to the neighborhood and what are some of the challenges with it as it currently sits today. So again, we're learning a lot about this part of the neighborhood. So I'm going to go into a little bit of our analysis, and then you'll see where we are in terms of what we're proposing now. So we took many cues from the adjacent street, mainly thinking about the Charles Street. So looking at the elevations of those streets, we thought really provided an interesting perspective of the way that the different buildings are actually creating an amazing kind of tapestry of buildings, looking at it from base, middle, and top, and the variety that actually is there in some ways not so obvious if you're just walking down the street and sort of understanding that. So we really started thinking about both sides of Charles. And then obviously the Whitney side of Charles with the garage has a much different aesthetic, larger windows, vertical pilasters of brick and sort of a very symmetrical kind of approach. And then the Whitney also has taken some of those clues and cues from its budding neighbors. And so thinking about that and how that starts to inform architecture as we're obviously building a new building of today, but we want to make sure it's thinking and thoughtful and a good civic neighbor to the history and its buildings around. And so we're doing some analysis in these slides, looking at those different aspects. We're looking at window patterning. We're looking at window dimensions. We're looking at top and cornice line alignments and sizes, and how the different sides of the street actually have slightly different or majorly different aspect of how they're sitting on the street. So again, just some of the context of what we're looking at adjacent to our site. And so this is kind of now zooming out and looking at a bird's eye axon of what we're actually proposing on the corner. So we are proposing a 6-story building that will honor the public realm at the street. So the edge of the CVS, which is this curved edge that you can sort of see on the bottom. So we're honoring and keeping that. That's our property line. We are proposing that to be a commercial space on the ground floor. And then above that, we're looking at 4 stories of residential, which will have approximately 13 units is what we're currently looking at in terms of the program. And then we're actually proposing the 6th floor. As you can see, the setback of that is really intended to kind of mimic and sort of match some of that dynamic movement of the top cap of the buildings that we saw along Charles, and then also some of the movement that we see on Top Shelf and then down to the Whitney. So in terms of just the simple program of what we're thinking, that's how we're seeing this. We are proposing to cantilever floors 2 through 5 over the sidewalk and really complete the square, I'll say, in terms of the curvature of the site below. But we think it's important to actually have an edge at this corner that is referential to the Whitney edge in the way that you're anchoring it urbanistically and visually to set up the Charles Street corridor. So that is sort of the basic principles of the program and the building. And then sort of diving a little bit deeper in, because a lot of the conversations we've had in the community have been about the Whitney and the success of the Whitney. And we agree. We think it's a very handsome building, and it's reflective of a lot of the aspects that we believe are consistent with what we're proposing. And so here's just a sort of close-up diagram of looking at some of its specific detailing, probably more so stepping back and thinking about the way that the verticality of the pilasters in brick, and then the texturing and the individual detailing that starts to frame around the windows. So we're obviously still early in our process, but we're starting to make sure that what we're proposing is reflective of what we're seeing around in the neighborhood. And then you could see sort of the then red edges of sort of those moments of anchoring at the streetscape and then also at the cornice line at the top. So as we kind of take that same concept in terms of the diagramming and then I'll say apply it to how we're thinking about the architecture of this space, you can see sort of the similar cues that we're looking at. So the yellow is representing the verticality of some of those moments that land on the ground. And then we also have the moments of verticality that are cantilevered or floating above that moment on the corner. And then we're also looking at how these top caps and top edges are starting to frame the building. And so you can see how the 6th story is set back and having a slightly different relationship to the adjacent building. And then some of the aspect of how we're tying this building in to its context is thinking about the alignments of some of these edges and how they align with Top Shelf. And then as we move over to the Whitney and seeing those horizontal moments move through our project. So this is just a snapshot then of, without any diagram on it, of what we're seeing as sort of the proportions of the building, the verticality, the glass and moments with some infill panels. Again, early, we're still working this out, but understanding then how those residential units start to address this notion of corner unit. So we have a little bit more glass and a little bit different spacing as it relates to the Cambridge Street side, which you can see on this elevation here. And then we bring that regularization of the verticality of the windows and the proportions that start to pick up more of the alignment in the diagram that we showed in on the as you move down Charles Street. So we're kind of using the building as that corner moment to address really both sides of the street in terms of both edges, but also then thinking about it as we want it to be held together as a moment. And so we're working on the material and detailing to ensure that the different conditions of pilaster or columns landing and ones that are floating, we think should have a different treatment to it. But what we're trying to make sure is that the building has a uniformed material and architectural approach. So this is another little diagram, but just looking down straight at the top, Charles Street to the left, the Whitney to the left, and then Cambridge Street to the top. So this is a little bit of our architectural material diagram approach of how we're thinking about the applications of those materials. So we are looking at providing basically a full brick facade as it faces back down Charles Street on Silver Place. So this would be an all brick facade. We're returning that brick up northerly towards Cambridge Street to a moment just to sort of anchor that. And then this notion of, on the left-hand side, where we're using a new material, which we'll show you, which we're proposing terracotta, which is actually not a new material, but for this idea, or this building, but that will be based on sort of the spacing that we talked about in terms of the windows. So it's a little bit different treatment to it. And then we're looking at this front facade that faces Cambridge Street, and the train will be of a more modern terracotta facade with the brick detailing brought into it as an aesthetic. So going back to that same view, you can sort of see then the materials starting to be labeled in terms of how we're thinking about. So what we're really looking at is a copper sort of top penthouse space that will actually be for the mechanical panel. So all the mechanical will be in the building, quote unquote. So there's no visible mechanical from anywhere. It also does have a residential unit as well as a community room. And we are looking at a roof deck that would be outside of the community room on the corner, but this is all pushed back from the edge. And then we're looking at a mixture of a terracotta panel that's textured along with some brick infill when the columns or the verticals land on the ground. So we're sort of looking at those two materials on a broad way. So just quickly, because I think there's been a lot of conversation in the community about what's terracotta, what's brick, and so they're really basically very similar materials. They're both clay and base. They both sort of go through a same process where they're mixed and then formed and then fired. So they're really sort of complementary products that we think there's some great opportunity for us to bring some detailing into the terracotta. We all know brick, but when we're looking at the cantilevering and the way that the building is hovering, we think actually using a little bit more different material at that moment makes a lot of sense from an architectural standpoint. This is just another diagram looking at sort of the things we know in terms of what we're basing some of our first ideas about are proportion and scaling. So you can sort of see just the traditional scale and size of a brick module, which we fully understand. We're looking at some moments where that might be turned into a soldier course. And then we're pushing some idea of bringing the terracotta panel together with the same patterning as the brick to reinforce that. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to go through the last series of just rendered images from the different perspectives, looking at the building as it starts to frame its new place on this corner. So this is obviously looking back toward the Whitney, toward Charles, coming across from the bridge, in that moment there, and you can see sort of how we're aligning the masonry sort of base of the building to be knitted in with its neighboring heights. And then as we look up Charles, you can sort of see the regularization of those vertical moments. A little bit closer view of that silver place between the two buildings. And then another just spun around back to that same view. So that's where we are as of today. So appreciate any thoughts or comments.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. So again, maybe just sort of at the outset to start the discussion here, I want to just reiterate, or maybe say for the first time, but importantly, this is an advisory review, which we don't do often. Again, it has no effect in terms of we're not making a determination. So there's nothing conclusive about this. So we'll have opinions, but we will reserve the right to change our mind. And ultimately we'll need to adjudicate a formal application, which we appreciate may change to some potentially significant degree from this. And so I think what we're about tonight, commissioners, and for the proponent, is just to give some reactions and some, let's call it qualified guidance, which is to say, with a big asterisk. Again, this is kind of why I don't really like advisory reviews in general. you know, we're going to need to ruminate over this further and so forth, and have a more thorough discussion about it. But for the moment, I think we want to just give some reactions, and, you know, to the extent, commissioners, that you have views where you'd like to see this going, or what you'd like to see the proponents address, let's by all means, let's do that. But again, there's nothing determinative about this, and we reserve the right to change our mind. We're just giving you some initial reactions to this proposal from our perspective, again, with our limited jurisdiction and our narrow purview. This is wholly within our jurisdiction, and it is ripe for our consideration because it's in the historic district. And so our purview here is historical and architectural appropriateness of what's proposed for the historic Beacon Hill district. And so our views may or may not be related to other views that you may have heard in other forums, be it the Beacon Hill Civic Association, abutters meetings, and so forth. But it is ultimately our approval that you're going to need. And so from that perspective, that's where we're coming from, what we'll need to discuss. So let me just ask by a show of hands for the moment, because I know we want to be quick on time here. If commissioners, does everyone raise your hand if you've got some thoughts on this? And I just want to make sure everyone gets heard. Okay, Commissioner Feingold, Commissioner Jackson, anyone else? Commissioner Allen. Okay. Why don't we, I'll just start with you, Arian. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi, good evening. It seems to me this is very modern. Like, all of this is very modern. Like, when I saw this, I didn't know that I was looking at my neighborhood. It didn't look like I was looking at the city of Boston. So I'm just wondering, are we purposely going towards modern? Is that the point, to go towards this? It doesn't look like, I would never have said that this was Beacon Hill or Boston. So is that the point, to make it modern?
Okay. Chairman, can I just ask a question? I
Yeah.
mean, I'm happy to respond to every question, or how do you want me to handle this? I'm
tell you
trying
what,
to be
Well,
respectful.
just be honest.
Yeah, let's collect a few initial thoughts. It's a great question, and in the interest of moving
Sure.
this forward quickly.
That's fine. No,
So
I'm gonna try to write some notes so I can make sure I try to address. That's fine.
And let me, I wouldn't presume to speak for Commissioner Allen, but I will register a similar question, and I think I am curious about the sort of basic conceptual approach here. I understand, on the one hand, of course, there's a tension, right? It's a contemporary building, right? It's going to be built in the 21st century, and to some extent, arguably, or one could argue, it ought to reflect the aesthetic, the inspiration, the design principles of its time, as any good building would. But at the same time, we're in a historic district, and so our mandate again is architectural and historical appropriateness. And so how do we, the fundamental question, you know, how do you merge those two things? And I would also like to hear more about the sort of basic conceptual approach of how you approach this problem beyond simply things like sympathetic materials or roof lines or things like that. So we'll leave it at that for the moment. Arian, did you have further thoughts? I don't want to cut you off.
Well, no, I mean, you kind of touched upon where I'm going. I know that there have been people who've been creative when they brought new buildings to Boston, and it made it work. You know, the Hancock Tower was a great example. Back in, way back in the late 60s, early 70s, when they tried to reflect, and they literally reflected Boston, and it's beautiful. I don't see my city or my neighborhood at all when I look at this, and that's my great concern.
Okay, how about Commissioner Feingold? I think I saw your hand next.
I took Nick's advice and I made some notes, having looked at the presentation before.
Right.
So I'm going to read those notes so I don't ad-lib too much because I don't want to wander. First of all, I want to thank you for this presentation. It is appropriate to be informed of the historical and contemporary context. However, there is too much to look at, so I advise you to use a few selected images. Don't use all of them. Point 2. I view this presentation as a concept, not yet as a design. And I think in that regard, the axonometric you showed to me is good. Don't go back to it. Don't flip around. I'm just saying that because what I'm looking at is not good. The 3 on the Charles Street elevation as the final exclamation point in addition to this street, the brick wall should be a nicely proportioned rectangle from second floor to the top. No, as I call it, showing off of the ankle, quotes, by holding back the brick, by lifting the brick. The new openings should be more taut.
What is that?
More taut than the existing examples, meaning more narrow and taller, and without any detail or ornament. As I've learned in my work as a practicing architect for almost 50 years, what is new ought to be new and not copying. In my work, especially with the National Park Service, they were very clear that what you do is new and you don't copy. You can relate, but you don't copy. So in that regard, Ariane, I would disagree, but I do agree that this building is wrong as presented. Now, the brick wall, I'd suggest that the brick wall, in its nice proportion, should extend beyond the corner of the building as a slight cantilever. In other words, it reads as a plane of brick, except for the ground floor, a plane of brick from top to bottom and side to side, and exposing the edge, not turning the corner. On the Cambridge Street side, should be, like the axon shows, absolutely all glass, or at least a monochromatic rendition. Perhaps glass and terracotta, or glass and other materials are similar, but it should look like it's one material. The glass wall should butt into the cantilever, simply keeping these planes distinct. This would work for me as it looks out directly at the T station. 5, the roof edge should cantilever on this wall, on the roof at the where you show the windows there, and the plan shows it sort of being at the same plane. I think that roof edge, that whole piece, should cantilever out over the wall until it recedes as proposed. The current concept is not good. This might have the possibility of the top floor and the street floor below talking to each other, as one of your diagrams indicated. The wall under the cantilever could be brick with a simple opening, or as repeating one such as I suggest on Charles Street. 6, the bottom ground floor would be a colonnade at its outer edge, similarly to talk to that element in the hotel across Charles Street. And therefore, when you put that together, you have the top and the bottom talking to each other with their curving walls, and the colonnades across the street, so as I call it, talking to each other, but with a clear distinction of what is on Charles Street and what is on Cambridge Street. I think you should try these as a schematic to and review them for review with other suggestions as you might hear. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mo. Ralph, Commissioner Jackson.
I think you're in a really challenging location. You've got the MBTA station with this great glass facade, and you've got the Whitney, which is an incredibly well-resolved and thought through elevation. And you're not at that stage. I think your cantilever is incredibly ambitious. I don't know if you've had a structural engineer look at. I did diagrams trying to figure out how do you create a span that allows you to cantilever as much as you're showing in your plans and your elevation. I'd share the diagrams with you if you'd like to see them. I disagree with my colleagues. I think that this building could be all glass. You're at the end of one world and you're entering another. So to my mind, greater transparency is a worthy strategy for your location to celebrate that transition. But I think the quality of the elevation, that introduction of that gray soffit, I feel as if dividing the building vertically into two sections is the wrong approach. That you should celebrate the verticality, celebrate the transparency, and not try to scale it to something that it can't relate to around it. So from my point of view, the materiality, I'm looking, if you go to your last slide of your Charles Street elevation,
Nick, I think you're on the wrong way.
I think this is really the party wall that corner is really unfortunate. The gray band is unfortunate. So given what's happening across the street, I find it challenging to see this as a well-resolved facade. I'm sorry that you chose to do the penthouse in copper. I think you should be more uncompromising in terms of your language and continue the transparency or the terracotta up. Yes, set it back, but the biggest challenge is how big the cantilever is. These other things, I think over time you can easily get rid of that drop gray soffit, make it all terracotta, make the what do you call it? The balustrade at the top and that element at the first floor, similar depth, and I think you'll be more on your way. So to my mind, being unique at this corner is desirable. But in terms of the execution, if at some point you want to see the stuff that I sort of suggest, I'd be happy to show you, but I'm troubled by it feels as if the designer hasn't found their footing yet.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. I will offer my thoughts now. And I'll try to I'm not so much summarize or even paraphrase. Again, I wouldn't presume to speak for my colleagues, but I guess I would echo a few of the sentiments, maybe perhaps in a different way. And when I look at this design, candidly, I see a lot, and I'll just reiterate what I said before, that I think that certainly there is a principle that a building ought to be of its time, certainly to a certain, perhaps a significant extent, even in and perhaps especially in a historic district. This, I do certainly agree with my colleague Commissioner Jackson that this is a really complicated, challenging site. But I would say it even a little differently and say it's a really important site. Certainly, as you laid out at the beginning of the presentation, it's a very important gateway, both to, frankly, the oldest historic district in the Commonwealth. We're right on the edge of what was originally the Shawmut Peninsula, what originally made up the land that would become the city of Boston. So this is original, territory in that respect. But of course, it's also a gateway to the city of Boston, just being on the other side of the Longfellow Bridge, itself an important piece of historic architecture from Cambridge. And so it does have a lot of heavy lifting to do, I think, architecturally, and in terms of what it's going to mean for the community. I would also say, sadly, it's at the intersection of two streets that have been rather tragically affected by the growth of the city over time. Both of these streets being major thoroughfares in their day, Charles and Cambridge Street, having been widened and a very significant amount of historic fabric having been lost. And so I think it's really, really important that we get this right. And it needs to be not just a good building, I dare say, but a really special one that will endure for many generations to come, just as we would hope, or we can observe that the great landmarks of architecture in Beacon Hill have done. When I look at this design, candidly, I see a lot that is of this moment in design that is popular, for lack of a better word. And I don't mean that necessarily in a derogatory sense, but in architecture now, right? I see, the oblong shape, which I know is common in your own designs at Rhodey. I've looked at your portfolio, the mix of material, the softening of the corner with the different, the continuing the fenestration around the corner and keeping it all glass instead of, or just simply treating it differently than the rest of the facade. The distinct verticality, the plate glass windows, and so forth. What I don't see, and maybe here's where I'm sympathetic with Commissioner Allen's remarks, is something that is specifically evocative of Beacon Hill. And I know that's a kind of a crude characterization or simple characterization, but and when I said before about I see kind of where you're coming from, but I'm not sure I see the conceptual approach about how do you handle this problem, this very challenging problem, as Commissioner Jackson nicely articulated, of what do you do with this spot that's got to be a gateway in both respects, that's got to respond to this new piece of architecture across the street, that's got to respond to these two pieces of quite modern contemporary architecture in the Appleton Bridge on the one hand, and the MBTA station on the other, not to mention the unusual sort of curvilinear facade of the building just to the left in what we're looking at here. So how do you handle all those things and still make this distinct, sensitive, and special? One of the things I think that's missing in my observation that is, and again, there's lots of ways you can do this. Commissioner Feingold had, I think, a pretty clear view about not copying, but notwithstanding the fact that I see a lot of what's popular now, I don't see really any classical vocabulary at all in this design, which of course is utterly pervasive in Beacon Hill. in so many respects. And of course, while we can talk about particular elements or motifs and things like that in classical design, of course, to my mind, the most important hallmark of classical design is proportion. And when I look at this candidly, I see, yes, a response to the gateway notion of the building and having this cantilever and the sharp corner and so forth. And yes, indeed, it's a response to the Whitney across the way. And I appreciate it for that, for sure. But candidly, I also see, again, what what now predominates in commercial design, which is building out in every square inch of the land that you can to maximize the value, rather than a sensitivity to the site that makes that consideration a secondary and so forth. And so I guess I'm agreeing with my colleagues that I really don't think we're there yet. I personally don't believe, and again, I'm not speaking for Commissioner Allen here, but I don't believe that you can't be distinct and contemporary and 21st century and use classical vocabulary at the same time. Just last night, I saw a presentation by a great British designer at the Boston Athenaeum, a great treasure in our district. And he talked extensively about the new development of Poundbury in Dorset in the United Kingdom, and a number of other references of where a more traditional classical vocabulary that we'd see all over Beacon Hill has been used successfully in contemporary buildings. And I think when it's done well, it is unmistakable that the building is still of its time, but it more directly references a lot more of that history. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from. I think I will say to Commissioner Feingold's point about the examples you used, I do feel there's a bit of cherry picking, maybe unintentional, of sort of finding examples that it feels to me like it's more justifying the design than motivating the design. Yeah, there's cases where you have projecting bays rendered in metal rather than brick and so forth, but it's a rare exception, and it's a much newer example in Beacon Hill. And certainly there are other materials and other colored stone and so forth, but I don't see a lot of the much more pervasive sort of program or stylistic influences or use of materials that are much more common than maybe some of the examples that you've shown. That doesn't mean that it needs to look like that necessarily. I'm just saying that I'm lacking that. It's much less clear to me where the motivation and what the concept is, where this is coming from, both solving this problem on the one hand, this admittedly, I don't envy you the task, very challenging site, but also referencing in a harmonious, distinct but harmonious manner, the historic architecture that characterizes the district. And I apologize that that's long and rambling and maybe not too specific, but I think we're not there yet, candidly. Commissioner Fleck, did you want to weigh in? No pressure, but you have the floor if you want it.
No, I mean, much of what I was going to say has been said. I would just, thank the roadie for, the boldness, right? I don't think it needs to look like Beacon Hill, given its location and its site. I appreciate the provocativeness of the because it's leading to the conversation we're having. So I'd encourage him to, keep thinking bold, but, take to account because I'm not an architect, so I don't have nearly the training or the vocabulary that my colleagues have. But as a resident, I can appreciate the opportunity that the site presents and look forward to continuing the discussion and coming up with a solution that will, in fact, stand for generations. So I'll turn the floor over to I'm assuming the public gets to comment in an advisory.
Not this time. They'll have a chance when we've got a formal application. Yeah, we're not going to take public comment this time.
But that's kind of my view in a nutshell. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Commissioner Fleck. And I appreciate, by the way, again, I should have said at the outset to the Rhodey team, I certainly, we very much appreciate all the effort that you put into this, and we do appreciate that, while we have the final say over this, we understand that this is a sensitive topic that's already, I'm sure, required a lot of work and meeting with stakeholders and different stakeholders with lots of different views and so forth. And I don't envy the challenge of trying to make sense of all of those points of view, many of which may conflict with each other, and try to come up with something that a lot of people will love. But I think that's that there is a longstanding tradition in this neighborhood, and it's I think an honor and a joy to serve with folks like my colleagues who just have very, very high standards and want something that is not just very, very good, but really great, and are willing to put in the work and the risk the potential challenging conversations to make it not just really good, but really great. Because again, it does need to endure. I wonder, let me just ask as a question, and I don't mean to suggest I'm ignorant of the many hours that have already gone into this and lots of thinking and study. But if I were starting from scratch on this, and again, I appreciate that's not our process. We're not involved in the beginning. That's a different situation, but I might like to see, and it would be helpful, I'll just tell you, it would be helpful for me to see, to go back to Commissioner Feingold's initial observation that he's treating this as a concept rather than a design. For me, it would be helpful to see like an evolution of concepts. This is how here are some alternative strategies for addressing this very difficult, challenging problem. And there are a few different ways you could go about it. And to make it a little more specific, here's conceptually what that approach might entail, and that in turn, what it might kind of sort of look like. And then maybe there's an argument that says, okay, so here's the evolution of our thinking. Okay, high level, there's a few different ways you could approach this. Here's what those might mean. Here's what they might look like. And we rejected, A, B, and C for the following reasons, because they failed on these accounts, we thought. And so that's how we came to the concept that we're favoring. Maybe that's just unnecessarily or just too hard to do. But it would be helpful to me to see something like that. And again, I wouldn't speak for her, but it might be helpful for Commissioner Allen. She can chime in, as well, to see, because it sounds like we've got a pretty distinct difference of opinion about what we might like to see here. And so if we had a few alternatives to look at, even just conceptual ones, that might be helpful.
I agree, Ms.
Yeah,
Mark,
I agree as well.
Mark, I think it's easier to do that now, after hearing the criticisms, than when they were working in a closed system.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So now they've got a series of directions that they can sort of look at, respond to, more or less. But I think it's hearing the criticism is, I think, part of the process. They needed to hear from us to find out where our head, what we were thinking in relation to something they produced. Now they can go back and sort of look at a series of alternatives.
I really agree with that. And I love that, I think, Mark, you brought this up, and maybe a couple of you might have brought this up, the idea of it being long-standing and not just stuck to the flavor of the month, but something that could actually last. I think that would be really helpful if there's going to be a new building in this historical neighborhood, then something that could really endure with time and not.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah, I like that.
In the words of our enabling legislation, it talks about, in talking about the purposes of establishing the historic district, that, that Beacon Hill would be this monument in the history of architecture. And so, when we think about, we could all rattle off favorites. We heard one mentioned, which I happen to agree with because I worked in that building for 19 years. But that's as much a part of the fabric of Boston as anything. But when we think about architecture as defining a place, you know, in a movie, if you want to show that you're in Paris, you show the Eiffel Tower. In India, it's the Taj Mahal, and so forth.
In
Of
Boston,
course,
the tower.
yeah, and so you know, it's a bold ambition, but I think it's consistent with our history in this neighborhood to say we want something that 100 years from now, someone is going to say, man, that's a fantastic example of, I mean, even just nationally, but a fantastic example of 21st century architecture. And man, what a challenge it was, but boy, did they get it right. And it just works so well. And I can't imagine that spot without that building. And so you're hearing a lot of what sounds negative, but it's coming from a positive place because we want something that will endure for the ages and be loved.
I'm going to disagree. I think you're being dismissive of the effort that they've made to sort of integrate what their perception of what directions we might want materially for the project to go in. The terracotta, the copper roofs, the punch windows. I don't, you may not find the solution successful, but they were engaged in trying to find middle ground.
Oh, for sure. No, I forgive me, Jack, Ralph. I did not mean to imply that at all. And I believe I said it, but I'll say it again. I appreciate you said 2 years. It's been a monumental effort, both in the thinking, the planning, the designing, the consulting, the interaction with stakeholders, and all of the complex web of not necessarily perfectly articulated, but often conflicting views that you were probably assaulted with along the way. And then just the challenge for your client to make a building that will work for them as the owner, not just of this building, but the adjacent. For sure, Ralph, I'm sorry if it came across that way, and I didn't mean to be dismissive of the effort at all. I want to say for the record, I very much appreciate the effort. And I'm sure, even though I didn't get to witness it directly, that it was very, very significant. And we appreciate all the work you've done to get it this far.
Yeah, I would just say open-mindedness, I think, is really important at this point, right? There's a lot of examples of buildings that when they were proposed were probably extremely provocative and revolutionary. I mean, Lincolnshire towering over the neighborhood at its height and mass that it is today. We don't give it a second thought. The radical departure from what you see on Chestnut Street, right? So, and I'm just, plucking out a couple of examples. I know Brattle Square in Cambridge intimately, some of the stuff that came up from the, Howard Alcus's building and other things that are just wildly modern. But today they work and they fit. And it's not that we have to be that extreme, but I think there's an opportunity because of the site to not be so wedded to, the traditional forms and the federal style and all of that. And I appreciate the boldness of the vision and the dialogue, right? So it may be just reinforcing what's already been said, but I think we can't just, overreact and say it doesn't look like Beacon Hill, therefore it's a failure. I think if it were purely to look like Beacon Hill, then I'd argue it's an opportunity that's lost, right?
Well,
I think it's not so much a matter of reaction, just saying it doesn't look like Beacon Hill. It doesn't, if it's gonna be in the neighborhood, it needs to represent. Doesn't mean that it has to be like the idea, and I mentioned it earlier, the Hancock Tower, if you know the history about the tower.
Sure.
There were people who protested it. It was a lot that went on with that. And the end result, what you mentioned, I couldn't imagine Boston without it. And yes, it does help that it does literally reflect the city. That was a great idea. So I'm in leads with Mark on the idea of something that is great. So if you bring something to the table that enhances what Beacon Hill already is, I will embrace that. And I think that you're right. The idea of just trying to recreate what's already there might not be the greatest idea, but at least there'll be something that is harmonious, genuinely harmonious.
I'm concerned that the building to the left of their site is a complete abdication. It's safe to get through this committee, but a complete abdication of the role of architecture.
So Ralph, we should wrap up, but you
Okay.
know, that's kind of, no, I appreciate that comment because it's apropos of what I think I was trying to get at, that it would just be helpful to me, and it sounds like to others, to have a more
Okay.
thorough explanation of the sort of conceptual approach. And so, for example, and I'm not suggesting that we would do this or anyone would like this, but you could say, well, okay, let's be primarily responsible to that building next door. And then, you know, you sketch that and you realize, oh God, that doesn't work at all. And then you get much more comfortable. Okay, it's clearly it's not that. So what is it? And it moves you closer to what it is. In screenwriting, we have an adage that says you find out what works from what doesn't work. So you try something and you realize how terrible it is, and then you say, okay, it's not that. Why isn't it that? Okay, now that helps me get closer to the thing it is. And so that, just what you said, Ralph, is a nice illustration of what I'm talking about. You know, oh my goodness, we don't want to, let's not make matters worse with the building to the left, etc. So I don't know if that is, I hope this is helpful. I hope it's not too discouraging. It's just, we're coming from a place, we want this, we've got an opportunity now. It's just an advisory review, but to give you some sense of where we're coming from and where we'll be coming from when we review this as a formal application. We look forward to continuing what we hope will be a very productive discussion. We knew this was going to take probably a few rounds just because of the nature of it. Any big project, for what it's worth, I don't know if it's any consolation, but even a big renovation of a big townhouse that is not especially radical in its design often will take multiple iterations through this commission, just because, again, there's a lot of details and we want to make sure we get them right. And so this is likewise, it's a big, important project. It's got a lot of work that's gone into it, a lot of details. And so we knew it was going to take probably a few rounds before we were able to make a determination on it. So this is just step one, but we appreciate very much your attention and coming in and the presentation, and look forward to continuing the discussion.
I probably should say something like unbelievable, but what I'm going to say is unbelievable. I'm going to say thank you, because you have basically been in our office for the last 2 years, and you summarized it beautifully with all your thoughts tonight. And, you know, we understand the gravity of this site, and I think the exploration of what can happen here and what this moment means, it's not lost on us. And, you know, we've been out in the community. I think we've had 10 community meetings of all different sorts. We've heard every different perspective, every different thought, every different one. And, you know, it is the challenge that we have, and we understand that and we appreciate it. And sure, some days are a little harder than others, but your feedback and your comments.
Excuse
Yes.
me.
Yeah.
Just picking up on that comment you just made, I think it's wise to remember that it is important to listen to your client, and your client in this case is many groups, as you described.
Yep.
But not to react to them all. You know that we as architects, we internalize all that, and then the idea is to go away quietly and then come back with an idea that represents your own view of in architecture, what all those wishes are. But it can't be this potpourri, which is really not an idea. So,
yep.
So go back to the basics, if you will, as Mark suggests, and do some alternatives. Like I said, that axon is a good diagram of a starting point, and do some more exploration. and we wish you luck. It's hard. It's a bit of chutzpah to say one is going to design a timeless building. We don't know if we have it within us at any moment to do that, but you just keep working and working and working until you try to get it right. And you've got a terrible, really important corner and a big challenge, and good luck.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else from the architect? Sorry, didn't want to cut you
No,
off.
no. Again, just thank you for your comments. And we appreciate your thoughts and your insight, and we'll see you when we see you next.
Great. Well, we look forward to it. Thank you again for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I think we got just a couple of more matters on the agenda here. We'll be quick since we're running late here, or running long administrative items. Let's just, Nick, can you put up the list? I've got the agenda here. I just want to make sure we don't need any
Sure.
recusals or anything here. Administrative is, where are they?
Oh.
Yep. Okay. Any,
Yep.
thank you, Nick. Any comments, questions, thoughts on concerns, administrative items?
Not from me.
Okay. Does anyone want to make a public comment on the administrative items? Okay, hearing none. Do I hear a motion to approve the administrative review items en masse?
I motion to approve them.
Okay, do I hear a second?
Second.
We will vote. Commissioner Allen,
Aye.
Mr. Feingold,
Aye.
Mr. Fleck,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
and Commissioner Kiefer votes aye. Administrative review items are approved. And I think next is probably minutes. Nick, I think I emailed you a few just edits on the minutes. Have those been reflected?
Yes, those are reflected in the revised minutes that you
that I would have received. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, sorry.
Okay. Any comments, questions, further revisions to the public hearing minutes of February 20th, 2025? Okay. Do we hear a motion to approve the minutes?
No moves.
Motion to approve.
Okay. Can we treat that as a secondary?
Yeah, I second it.
Okay, we'll vote Commissioner on the motion to approve the public hearing minutes of February 20, 2025. Commissioner Allen,
Aye.
Mr. Feingold,
Aye.
Mr. Fleck,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
and Commissioner Kiefer votes aye. The minutes are approved. And with that, staff updates. Nick.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. So just a couple reminders here. Just make sure your profile information is up to date on the portal, including your resume, contact information. So just update that, make sure that you if anything's changed, that it's up to date. And then, as we already mentioned earlier in the hearing, the virtual hearings have been extended until 2027. They're technically going to be hybrid, but right now we're just operating under the assumption that it's going to be a virtual hearing. And if anything changes, I will keep you up to date.
I'm sorry, which hearings, please?
All of the hearings are virtual, Mo.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to keep doing it like this.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
That's- that's-
Yeah, they're just kicking the can. They're not making any final decisions just yet, but and so it is. But
Yeah.
so yeah, that's basically all I have for staff updates today.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Okay, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, all in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for your patience, and thanks for a lively discussion. I know it ran on a little bit, but I hope it will be helpful, and we'll look forward to seeing the next version of that. But very thoughtful. Thanks for particularly for looking at that stuff in advance so you could be ready to comment it. That's very much appreciated.
Thanks, Mark.
Happy spring, guys.
Happy spring. See you soon.
See
Take
ya.
care.
Bye.
Good night.